Chapter 26, Chapter 26 Will you? General POV. When Samael woke, there was no trace of fatigue in his body. Despite spending most of the night talking with Alice, he felt perfectly fine. Ever since he had begun absorbing life force, his body had changed in ways that went beyond simple strength, rest had become optional, and exhaustion no longer meant what it once did. Still, there was something different about this morning. Something anticipatory. As he moved through his routine, his phone buzzed softly in his hand. Alice, good morning, Sammy. Love, Alice, did you sleep well? Alice, although I know you didn't have much time. A faint smile appeared on his lips as he leaned against the counter and typed back. Samael, morning, Pixie. Samael, I'm used to sleeping for short periods. Samael, so I feel perfectly fine. The response came almost instantly. Alice, good, happy face. Alice, I was worried you wouldn't feel good. Alice, and wouldn't come to school. His smile widened slightly as he replied. Samael, oh? Samael, you wanted to see me that much? There was no hesitation. Alice, of course. Alice, do you even have to ask? He let out a quiet chuckle. Samael, not really. Samael, but what about you? Samael, you slept no more than I did. There was a brief pause before her reply came through. Alice, MMH. Alice, I slept enough, happy face. Alice, don't worry about me. Alice, I feel great. Samael watched the screen for a moment, a small, knowing smile forming. Samael, sure, sure. There was a brief pause before she continued. Alice, are you on your way yet? Samael stepped outside, phone still in hand. Samael, about to leave. Alice, good, happy face. Alice, I'm already on my way. Another message appeared right after. Alice, I'll be waiting for you, love. Samael glanced at the screen for a moment, his expression softening slightly. Waiting? His gaze lifted toward the window. A light rain was falling, steady and quiet, the sky thick with clouds. He could feel it, something he had gained from the vampires he had hunted. The rain wasn't stopping anytime soon. At least a couple of hours. He let out a quiet breath. If it was anyone else, he might have doubted it. But this was Alice. A faint smile formed. She would definitely be waiting. Samael, see you at school, Pixie. Alice, hurry up, Sammy, winky face. 15 minutes later, Samael pulled into the school parking lot, immediately noting how much more crowded it was compared to the previous day. Cars continued to arrive in a steady stream, students stepping out and quickly making their way toward the building, their movements hurried as they tried to avoid the persistent rain. He found an empty spot and parked, the engine falling silent as he stepped out into the cool, misting rain. The air was crisp, fresh in that way only rain could make it, but beneath it lingered something else, something warmer, softer, immediately familiar. It was the same honey-like scent from the day before. His senses sharpened instinctively as he inhaled again, unconsciously searching for it, letting it settle deeper as his awareness narrowed around it. Without quite realizing it, he leaned slightly into the sensation, as if drawn toward it. Then he heard it, light footsteps approaching from behind. A small smile formed as he turned. Alice stood there. She held an umbrella loosely over her shoulder, the dark fabric shielding her from the rain while faint droplets clung to the edges of her neatly tousled pixie-cut hair. The soft strands framed her face naturally, complementing the fitted coat she wore, its muted tone blending seamlessly with the quiet morning. She was silently smiling at him. Samael stepped closer, closing the distance between them with calm, unhurried ease, his gaze steady as it settled on her. Rain dotted his shoulders and darkened the fabric of his clothes, but he didn't spare it a single thought. I think I said something like this yesterday, he said, his voice low and warm, but it clearly needs repeating. His eyes lingered for a moment. You look incredible. Her gaze held his a second longer than it had the day before, softer, heavier and slightly unsteady in a way that hadn't been there before. There was something different about her now, something deeper beneath the surface, as if the night they had spent talking had settled into her more than it should have, sharpening every emotion just a little further. For a brief moment, she simply looked at him like that. Then her expression warmed, the intensity easing naturally as a soft, musical laugh slipped from her. Thank you, she said, her voice light but warm. And you look suspiciously good for someone who barely slept. Samael's lips curved faintly. I could say the same, he replied. Though I'm starting to think the conversation had something to do with that. Alice's eyes brightened instantly. Oh, definitely, she said. I don't think I've ever been so happy to lose sleep. He let out a quiet breath of amusement before gesturing lightly toward the school building. Shall we? She didn't hesitate. Always, she said, stepping easily to his side. They walked together through the rain, the umbrella shifting as Alice tried to angle it to cover him as well, though the difference in their height made it slightly awkward. After a moment, Samael reached up without a word and took the umbrella from her, adjusting it so it covered them both. Their conversation resumed just as naturally as if it had never paused the night before. I don't like the idea of you waiting out here in the rain for me, he said. Alice tilted her head slightly, her smile turning playful. I wanted to see you, she replied, a light note in her voice. And a little rain isn't nearly enough to stop me. He studied her for a brief moment before letting out a quiet, amused breath. Then I'll have to make sure I arrive first next time, he said, a hint of laughter in his voice. Wouldn't want to keep the lady waiting. Her smile turned a touch more playful. Planning ahead already? Always, he answered easily. By the time they reached the building, the rain had softened. They stepped inside together, the warmth replacing the chill as the distant noise of the hall settled around them. Their pace slowed naturally as they reached her locker. Alice moved quickly, opening it and gathering her books before turning back to him. We have history before lunch, she said lightly. Don't be late. Suddenly, she stepped closer, and Samael noticed the movement clearly, but he didn't move, his attention fixed on her, curious to see what she intended. She leaned in and pressed a quick, soft kiss to his cheek. Just as quickly, she pulled back. I'll see you there, Sammy, she added, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips before she turned and slipped into the flow of students. Samael remained still for a brief moment, his hand rising instinctively to touch the spot she had kissed, a faint smile forming as he exhaled softly. See you, Alice, he murmured under his breath. A few feet away, one student who had been watching a little too closely let his forehead drop against his locker with a quiet thunk. Why is the world so unfair? He muttered. His friend gave him a look, then patted his shoulder like he'd just witnessed something tragic. Man, he said, shaking his head, we never even had a chance. His first class passed quickly, though not quite as smoothly as usual, as his attention drifted more than once back to a certain pixie-like girl somewhere else in the building. By the time he reached the history classroom, only a few students had arrived. Alice was already there near the back, and the moment she spotted him, her face lit up without hesitation as she lifted her hand slightly. Sammy! Over here! A couple of nearby students glanced over, more surprised by how easily she called out to someone who had only been there for a day, but Samael paid them no attention at all. He simply crossed the room and took the seat beside her. How was your first class? He asked as he settled in. Alice leaned a little closer, her expression bright. Honestly? Boring, she said. Trigonometry this early should be illegal. A quiet hint of amusement touched his expression. I can imagine, he replied. She gave a small, knowing nod. I do way better with things I actually care about. Oh, he asked, glancing at her. She nodded. Art, design, fashion, anything with a bit of personality. His gaze lingered on her for a second, a faint smirk forming. Yeah, he said quietly, I noticed it yesterday. Her lips curved, clearly pleased. Well, someone has to bring some style into this town, she said lightly, tilting her head just a little. She held his gaze for a moment, then shifted forward with easy familiarity. What about you? Was yours any better? It was all right, he said. Nothing special. She hummed softly, then glanced at him with a small, knowing smile. Well, obviously, she said lightly, I wasn't there to make it interesting. His lips curved a little more at that, the amusement clear in his expression. Absolutely, he agreed easily, that does seem like the main issue. Her smile widened just slightly, clearly pleased with that answer. As more students filtered into the room and the lesson began, neither of the two paid much attention. The material was too familiar to hold their interest, and their conversation continued in low, easy tones, drifting from one subject to another. They talked about music for a while, Alice mentioning songs she liked, Samael adding a few of his own, which she listened to with brief consideration before giving a small, approving nod. At some point, she shifted slightly closer. The movement was subtle, almost unnoticeable unless someone was paying attention, but it wasn't accidental. Her shoulder brushed against his and stayed there, and neither of them moved away. After a while, Samael's thoughts shifted, drifting naturally away from their quiet conversation toward something different. Many people spent time wondering when the right moment was to ask a girl out, weighing options, overthinking possibilities, and hesitating far longer than necessary. In his previous life, he had always followed one simple rule: if you were sure she would say yes, and more importantly, that she would be happy about it, then you simply asked. There was no reason to complicate something so simple. It was a date, not a lifetime decision. So why wait? A faint smile touched his lips as the thought settled, and instead of asking plainly, he decided to make it a little more interesting. Alice, he murmured, I think I might want to break one of the promises I gave you. She stilled, her thoughts scattering for a brief moment as they were pulled in too many directions at once. His voice had been far too quiet, impossibly quiet, in fact, and her first instinct was to ignore it entirely, to pretend she hadn't heard anything at all, because no human should have been able to. And yet, he had spoken with a quiet certainty that made it feel as though he had known she would hear him. The realization settled quickly, bringing with it a question she couldn't quite push aside. Did he know? She had already seen enough to understand that he wasn't a normal shapeshifter, not something that fit into any familiar description, but this level of awareness made things even less simple. The thought lingered just long enough to matter, followed closely by another: how would he react if he knew what she was? That uncertainty stayed with her as she lifted her gaze to him, searching his expression carefully, but what she found there didn't match her concern. There was warmth in his eyes, something steady and calm, touched with a faint, quiet amusement that felt almost like teasing, yet carried no hint of suspicion or calculation. It didn't feel like a test. So she let the questions go, not because they had been answered, but because she chose to follow what she felt instead. Leaning in slightly, she lowered her voice even further, softer than his had been. Which promise? She whispered. He smiled. The fact that he heard her so easily did not escape her notice, and a flicker of surprise passed through her thoughts. Shifters weren't supposed to have hearing like that in their human forms, but it faded almost as quickly as it appeared when he continued without hesitation. We both know where this is going, he said softly, that same quiet confidence threading through his voice. So why wait? Would you go on a date with me, Alice? At that, all worried and questions seemed to fall away. She simply looked at him for a moment, her mind going still, not out of hesitation, but because there was nothing left to consider. Of course, she said immediately, her voice coming out just a little louder than intended. A few students turned, and the teacher glanced over. "Let's keep it down. This will be important for the test." Samael gave a small, polite nod, but Alice barely noticed, her attention still fixed entirely on him. "Tonight," she added quickly, lowering her voice again, her smile bright and unwavering. "Pick me up at 7. He studied her for a moment, clearly amused by her certainty. "All right," he said. "I'll plan something." She nodded quickly, her excitement impossible to hide now. "Good," she said, a quiet laugh slipping into her voice. "I can't wait." There was no trace left of her earlier uncertainty, no lingering doubt, just a light, unmistakable happiness settling naturally into her expression. Samael let out a soft breath of a laugh. "I'll make sure it's worth it," he said. She leaned just a little closer again, her shoulder resting comfortably against his. "It sure will be," she murmured. He glanced at her briefly before adding, "Send me your address later." "MMHM," she nodded quickly. "I will." Then, as if everything had simply settled into place exactly as it should have, she relaxed against his shoulder again, her pencil moving across her notebook in absent-minded sketches, though every so often her gaze drifted back to him, a small, lingering smile still playing on her lips. Samael's thoughts, however, had already moved somewhere else, drawn toward the evening ahead and, more specifically, toward Alice herself. He had a few ideas in mind, different places he could take her, nothing too complicated. But his thoughts didn't stay there. Without quite realizing it, they drifted further, settling not on the beginning of the evening, but on how it might end. He wasn't thinking about anything too far, like sex, because it was too early for that, but the idea of a kiss lingered in his mind, quiet at first, then harder to ignore. And that was when he made the mistake of looking at her lips. The reaction came instantly, before he could stop it, sharp and sudden in a way that made him go still for a brief moment. He shifted slightly in his seat, slow and controlled, trying to ease the tension without drawing any attention to himself, though it wasn't nearly as easy as he would have liked. Beside him, Alice's pencil slipped, the line on the page dragging off course as she paused and glanced down at it for a second before her attention shifted to him instead, her brows knitting together just slightly. She murmured, studying him now. "Are you okay?" Her question was simply out of concern. Samael didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said quietly, his tone calm and controlled. "The chair's a bit uncomfortable." Alice blinked once, then glanced down at her own seat as if checking it for herself. "Oh," she said, accepting the explanation without question. "Yeah, these are kind of terrible." Just like that, it made sense to her. The concern faded from her expression almost immediately, replaced by something lighter as she shifted slightly in her seat. "You want to switch?" she asked, already moving a little as if she might actually do it. Samael let out a quiet breath of amusement, a faint smile forming as he shook his head slightly. "It's all right," he said, "I'm fine." "All right," she replied, watching him for a moment longer as if making sure he meant it before relaxing again. Just as naturally as before, she leaned back into him without hesitation or second thought. Samael exhaled slowly, keeping his posture steady even though the situation wasn't nearly as resolved as he had made it seem. Beside him, Alice remained completely relaxed, unaware of anything beyond the simple explanation she had already accepted. Chapter 27, Chapter 27 Growl? As the history class came to an end, the low hum of conversation quickly filled the room. Chairs scraped softly against the floor, papers shuffled, and within moments, students began filtering out into the busy hallway. Samael and Alice walked side by side, naturally falling into step as they made their way toward the cafeteria. Alice glanced up at him, her eyes bright. "Let's sit together," she said, as if there had never been another option. "Of course," Samael replied, a faint hint of amusement in his tone. Then, after a brief pause, though we might not be alone. Alice tilted her head slightly before following his gaze. Oh, you mean him, she said. I don't mind. Up ahead, Peter was walking in their direction, though noticeably less confident than usual. His steps slowed once or twice, like he was debating whether to approach or turn away. Alice watched him for a moment, then leaned slightly closer to Samael. You found yourself a good friend, she said quietly. Not many people would care whether they're interrupting. Samael gave a small nod, a faint smile forming, and lifted his hand in a casual wave. Peter noticed immediately, his uncertainty disappearing as a grin spread across his face. He picked up his pace and joined them. Hey, dude. What's up? He said, his eyes briefly flicking toward Alice with clear curiosity. Hey, Samael replied, gesturing toward her. You've probably heard of her already, but this is Alice Cullen. Alice gave a small wave. Hi. Hi, Peter replied quickly, then added with a grin, yeah, I've heard. Hard not to. She'll be sitting with us today, Samael added. Peter blinked. Wait, seriously? He let out a disbelieving huff of laughter, glancing between them. I did not expect to see one of the Cullens join someone else at lunch. Alice's smile turned just slightly more playful as her gaze flicked to Samael. Well, she said lightly, he's a pretty good reason to change things. Peter snorted, shaking his head before leaning closer to Samael. Man, he muttered, half amused, being friends with you might be bad for my self-esteem. Samael let out a quiet laugh but didn't comment. The hallway grew louder as they approached the cafeteria, voices blending into a steady hum. Alice turned back to Samael, her expression bright. By the way, Sammy, I brought you a lunchbox today. So don't even think about getting anything from the cafeteria. Samael slowed slightly, caught off guard. You, cooked. Then something clicked, and his expression shifted, becoming more cautious. Alice lifted her chin a little. I had some help, she admitted, but I made most of it. That didn't reassure him. Peter looked between them, confused. Okay, what am I missing? Isn't that a good thing? Alice blinked once, then understood immediately. A soft giggle slipped out as she nudged Samael lightly with her shoulder. Sammy, did you really think I would bring those vegetables? Samael exhaled, the tension leaving him. In that case, I'll gladly accept your offer. Alice's laughter softened. Don't worry, she added, a quiet certainty in her tone. I know you'll love it. Samael's gaze lingered on her for a moment. He understood what she really meant. She had already seen it, in her vision. Peter glanced at her briefly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, but he dismissed it just as quickly. Everyone had their quirks. Who was he to judge? They stepped into the cafeteria, the noise rising instantly around them. Peter's expression shifted as if he had just remembered something. A teasing smile slowly spread across his face as he looked at Samael. So you can be called Sam. But he didn't get to finish. Samael's hand landed on his shoulder. You can try, Samael said evenly. Then, after the slightest pause, but only once. Peter blinked, the rest of the joke dying in his throat. Once, he repeated, a bit more cautiously now. A faint smile spread on Samael's face. Once in your life. For a brief moment, Peter just looked at him. Then something in Samael's expression made it clear, very clear. It was a line. One he absolutely should not cross. Peter straightened immediately, almost like a soldier snapping to attention. Roger that. Without another word, he broke eye contact, already taking a step back as if distance might save him. I'll go find us a table. And with that, he quickly disappeared ahead into the cafeteria. Alice watched him go, her shoulders shaking slightly with quiet laughter before she turned back to Samael. You scared him, she said, clearly entertained. Did you see his face? Samael glanced at her, a smirk forming. He'll recover. Then, his expression softened slightly. Only you get to call me that. Alice's smile shifted, softening into something warmer. Good, she said gently. Then, a little more playfully. I wouldn't share it anyway. It didn't take long to spot Peter. He was already seated at an empty table, subtly guarding the space around him, turning away anyone who even looked like they might try to sit there. One particularly determined student seemed ready to argue, but before it could go further, Samael and Alice reached the table. Thanks, Peter, Samael said. For keeping the space. Peter relaxed immediately, a grin spreading across his face. Anytime, brother. Samael's attention shifted briefly to the student. Sorry. This table's taken. There was no edge to his tone, but there was no room for argument either. Samael didn't wait for a reaction. He simply took his seat, and Alice followed beside him as naturally as if it had always been hers. The student hesitated, then backed off. Across the cafeteria, the rest of the Cullens had already gathered at their usual table. At first, there was a flicker of confusion when Alice didn't head toward them. But the moment their eyes landed on the person sitting beside her, everything clicked into place. Emmett leaned back in his chair, a wide, triumphant grin spreading across his face as he placed his open palm flat against the table in Jasper's direction, clearly waiting. Jasper let out a quiet sigh before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded bill. Without a word, he handed it over. Emmett took it without hesitation, his grin widening. Told you. Edith let out a soft laugh, while Rosalie exhaled slowly, her expression composed but her patience clearly thinner. Back at the table, Peter shifted in his seat before pushing himself up with a small stretch. I'm gonna grab something, he said casually. You know, since I don't have anyone bringing me food. Samael's lips curved into a smirk. Tragic. Alice, meanwhile, was already reaching into her bag, her movements careful as she pulled out a neatly wrapped container. It was about as large as she could fit inside, covered in foil. The moment it appeared, the scent followed. Rich, warm, and savory. Alice unwrapped it with care, then placed it in front of him. Here. He took it, his expression softening slightly. Thank you. When he opened the container, the contents were simple but perfectly prepared, several sausages alongside a large steak, still warm and juicy. He picked up the knife and fork, cutting into the steak before taking his first bite. Alice watched him closely, her attention fixed on every small detail, every reaction. He chewed slowly, taking a moment to consider, then gave a small, approving nod. It's really good. Her entire expression brightened instantly. You like it? Yes, he replied, glancing at her. The texture is right, and the flavors balanced. I'm not particularly picky with meat, but I can tell when it's done well, and this is. A soft, pleased giggle slipped from her, the satisfaction in her eyes impossible to miss. Samael hesitated briefly before asking, even though he already knew the answer. And you? Aren't you eating anything? She waved the concern away with an easy smile. Don't worry. I had a very good breakfast. He studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod and returned to his meal. Not long after, Peter came back carrying a tray and dropped into his seat across from them. His attention shifted almost immediately to Samael's food. That smells better than mine, he said, glancing down at his own tray before looking back again. Samael didn't respond, his focus fully on the meal in front of him. Peter hesitated, then pushed his luck just a little. Can I try a piece? Samael's gaze lifted at once, sharp and steady as it settled on him. At the same time, his hand shifted slightly closer to the container, the movement clear enough to answer the question without words. Peter raised both hands immediately in surrender. All right, man. I get it. You're hungry. What he didn't hear, what only a few in the cafeteria could, was the low, almost inaudible growl that slipped from Samael's chest. It was quiet, but feral. Alice froze for a brief moment, caught off guard by the sound, before her expression shifted, the surprise melting into amusement. A soft giggle escaped her as she looked at him, her eyes bright with it. The growl disappeared the moment Peter leaned back fully, abandoning any thought of trying again. At the Cullen table, however, the reaction was different. Every one of them stilled, their attention locking onto Samael at once as something deep and instinctive flared to life, a quiet but unmistakable sense of danger settling over them. Only when the sound faded, and Alice's laughter followed, did the tension begin to ease. Edith was the first to relax, a quiet laugh slipping from her as her posture softened, the edge gone as she understood what had actually happened. Jasper smiled right after, the last trace of tension leaving his expression. Even Rosalie's lips curved faintly as she eased, though her gaze shifted to Emmett, who hadn't quite relaxed yet. Without a word, she reached over, her fingers brushing lightly against his hand, and the remaining tension left him soon after. Meanwhile, Samael's attention was back on the food in front of him. In truth, he hadn't even noticed the growl. It hadn't been intentional, but from something deep within him, something that surfaced on its own the moment Alice placed the food in front of him. That reaction, simple as it was, came from instinct. Somewhere beneath everything else, the part of him that was not human had responded in the only way it knew how. Meat had been brought to him, and more than that, it had been brought by her, by the one he subconsciously recognized as his, by a lioness. His lioness had brought him food. And in that, there was no hesitation, no second thought, and absolutely no intention of sharing it. The rest of lunch passed calmly. Alice and Samael didn't feel the need to speak much, their presence was more than enough, so Peter carried most of the conversation. He moved from one topic to another before settling on organic chemistry, asking about compound groups and reactions. At some point, Samael's attention drifted across the cafeteria. Bella. She was sitting with Jessica and the others, though she didn't seem fully present in the conversation. Her gaze moved through the room as if searching for something or more like someone. Every so often, her eyes flicked back toward Alice and Samael, curiosity and uncertainty mixing as she tried to make sense of it. It wasn't difficult to see why. They had arrived at the school at the same time, and yet the two of them sat together and spoke with familiarity that made it seem as though they had known each other for far longer than they should have. Jessica, on the other hand, was unusually quiet. Where she was normally animated and full of energy, now she seemed dimmed. Although Samael simply didn't care. His attention didn't linger, and within moments, he looked away, the matter dismissed as easily as it had been observed. Samael finished his food and turned slightly toward Alice. "It was delicious," he said, his tone softer now. "Thank you." She met his gaze with warmth in her eyes. "You're welcome," she replied gently. "I'm really happy you liked it." Then, almost immediately, she continued. "I can bring you food every day." Samael raised an eyebrow. "Do I have a say in that matter, or has it already been made?" She shook her head. "No, you don't. It's already decided." A quiet laugh slipped from him. "In that case, I'll gladly accept such a fate." He dipped his head in a playful gesture, earning a giggle from her. Across the table, Peter watched them with a strange look on his face. "You know," he said slowly, "being around you two might actually give people diabetes." Samael glanced at Alice, catching her smile, before looking back at Peter. "If they don't like it," he said calmly, "they can keep their distance." Alice's smile deepened, her gaze lingering on him just a moment longer. Peter looked between them, shook his head, and let out a quiet huff of disbelief as he stood, gathering his tray. "I'll go throw this away." As he walked off, Samael turned back to Alice. "Was Bella the reason for your brother's situation yesterday?" he asked. Alice's eyes flicked briefly toward Bella before returning to him. Yes, she said, he had some kind of allergy to her perfume. He didn't handle it very well. Samael nodded slowly. And that's why he's not here today. She paused for just a fraction of a second before answering. He's visiting our family in Alaska. It was already planned, it just happened to be today. Must be difficult for him, he said, but with a knowing smile. After lunch, the rest of the day passed quickly. Classes came and went, conversations faded into the background, and before long, the final bell rang. Samael was already waiting by his car, the air still cool and damp from the earlier rain as he watched the steady flow of people leaving the building. Among them, he soon picked out familiar figures. Edith, Alice, and Emmett stepped out together, while Jasper and Rosalie were already at their cars, waiting. Alice noticed him immediately. Without hesitation, she broke away from the others and headed straight toward him. "Did you wait for me, Sammy?" she asked, her tone light, though there was a hint of curiosity behind it. A smile touched his lips. "It's only fair," he said. "You waited for me this morning." She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing just slightly in playful suspicion. "So you did it out of duty?" "It's a convenient excuse," he replied. Her smile widened at that. "Well," she said as she stepped a little closer, "I need to get ready for tonight, so I have to go." She leaned in, pressing a quick, soft kiss to his cheek before pulling back again. "I'll be on time," he said. A quiet laugh escaped her. "You better be." With that, she turned and made her way back to the others. Samael watched her for a moment as she walked away. Only once she rejoined the others did he turn, slipping into his car. There was still time before evening. And he fully intended to make use of it. Small announcement. From this point, future chapters will not be focused on school. This school arc was quite large, but my reason was simple, to introduce some characters and lay the groundwork for the relationships between Alice and Samael. Chapter 28, Chapter 28 He Knows? Jasper and Edith lingered beside their car in the school parking lot as the last of the students gradually dispersed around them, the usual noise and movement fading into the background. Emmett and Rosalie had left earlier. Edith stood close to Jasper, leaning slightly into him while his left arm rested comfortably around her waist, both of them focused across the lot where Alice had just stepped away from Samael after pressing a kiss to his cheek and mentioning that she needed to prepare for their date. Jasper's brow lifted slightly, and beside him Edith reacted at the exact same moment. "Wow," she murmured under her breath. She turned her head toward Jasper, and he met her gaze. The two of them shared a brief, knowing smile that didn't need to be explained. Jasper's expression settled soon after, returning to its usual composure. Beneath it lay the constant effort it took to remain this controlled while surrounded by so many humans. When Alice started heading toward them, they didn't wait. Without a word, they turned and made their way to their black Mercedes. Jasper slid into the driver's seat while Edith settled beside him, and only a few seconds later, the passenger door opened as Alice slipped inside. The moment the door closed, she leaned forward slightly, her voice bright and full of restless energy. "All right, let's go home, guys. I have so much to do," she said. Jasper allowed himself a small smile as he caught her reflection in the mirror, then briefly glanced at Edith before starting the engine and pulling away. The drive settled into a comfortable silence, filled only with the low hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the road, but Alice, unusually, remained still in the back seat, her usual liveliness replaced by a distant gaze as though her thoughts were already far ahead, running through everything she needed to prepare. After several minutes, Edith turned slightly in her seat, watching her with quiet amusement before finally breaking the silence. "So," she began lightly, "are you finally going to tell your dear sister what exactly is going on?" Alice blinked, pulled back from her thoughts, and for a brief moment, she looked disoriented before her expression softened into a smile. "Oh, Right. She began recounting everything, moving through the morning, the class, Samael, and most importantly, the fact that he had asked her out. Her voice was warm and animated as she lingered on certain details, as though replaying them while she spoke. Edith listened attentively, a soft smile forming on her lips as she let out the occasional quiet laugh, but as Alice reached the end, that expression gradually shifted into something more thoughtful, the amusement giving way to concern. "Alice," she said gently, though her tone carried more weight now, "have you thought about how you are going to tell him about us, about what we are?" She paused briefly, choosing her words with more care before continuing. "It's not something small, and it affects not only you, but him, and all of us as well." Alice tilted her head slightly, her expression remaining calm and almost unconcerned. "Oh, don't worry," she said lightly, "I think he already knows." The air in the car shifted at once, the quiet ease from before seems to disappear. Edith's eyes widened, and although she opened her mouth to respond, no words came out at first as she processed what that meant. Slowly, she turned her head toward Jasper, who was already glancing between her and the road, his brows faintly furrowed in thought. Edith turned back to Alice, her voice more focused now. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Did you tell him?" Alice shook her head immediately. "No," she said, "it wasn't me. I didn't tell him. I promised you I wouldn't say anything before talking to all of you." Edith's expression softened slightly at the reassurance, though the concern didn't fully leave her features. "Then how would he know?" she asked. "I didn't notice anything strange from him, nothing directed at us." She hesitated briefly before adding, "Don't shapeshifters usually hate vampires?" Her gaze shifted toward Jasper. A brief silence followed before he answered. "We've only encountered wolves," he said calmly. "It wouldn't be wise to assume all shapeshifters behave the same way." Edith nodded slowly, considering that. "I suppose not," she admitted, her gaze drifting slightly. "Still, whatever he is, he doesn't act like any of those dogs." There was a trace of disdain in the last word. She turned her attention again to Jasper. "So what did you feel?" she asked more directly. "From him, toward us?" Alice, who had been listening quietly until then, leaned slightly forward, her interest clearly piqued, though for entirely different reasons. Jasper gave a small nod as he kept his attention on the road. "His emotions are very clear to me," he said in his usual calm tone. "There's nothing hostile, nothing that suggests suspicion in that sense." He paused briefly, as if weighing how best to phrase the next part. "But they are strong, stronger than anything I've ever felt before." Alice straightened slightly at that, her attention sharpening even more. "Not all of them," he clarified, "but some, especially the ones connected to Alice," he added, a faint, almost amused breath leaving him. "There are moments when I have to distract myself when you're both together." Alice's expression lit up instantly, curiosity overtaking everything else. "What is he feeling about me, Jasper?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "Tell me." Edith glanced at her, just a little caught off guard by the sudden shift, but she didn't interrupt. Jasper met Alice's gaze briefly through the mirror, a small smile forming. "It isn't just one thing," he explained. "It's layered, difficult to separate, because so many of the emotions overlap." He paused again, then continued more deliberately. "But if I had to describe it, it's a mix of strong obsession, possessiveness, and desire." Alice went completely still for a moment. Then her smile deepened slowly, softer, her gaze drifting as her thoughts slipped somewhere more private. Jasper returned his full attention to the road. The words seemed to settle something in the car, though not entirely. After a brief pause, Edith turned to Alice, her tone more grounded now. "Why do you even think he knows?" she asked. Alice gave a small shrug. "I'm not sure if he knows exactly what we are," she admitted, "but he definitely didn't believe any of my excuses." A faint smile touched her lips. About Edward, about not eating, about sleep. She continued, this time describing the moment he asked her out in more detail, the way he had lowered his voice, so no human could hear, the quiet conversation that followed, and the fact that he could hear her just as clearly. That last part made Edith's expression shift again, surprise flickering across her face. By the time Alice finished, the car had already reached the house. Jasper turned off the engine. "We should discuss this with the others," he said. Edith nodded immediately, but Alice shook her head without hesitation. "I really don't have time for that," she said quickly, "I have so much to do, and I already told you everything, so you can explain it." Edith opened her mouth to argue, but stopped as she looked at Alice, quickly realizing it would be pointless. She let out a soft sigh. "Fine. We'll do it your way." Alice brightened instantly. "It's not such a big deal anyway," she added. "And Jasper didn't feel anything bad or strange from him, so it's going to be fine." Then she turned slightly toward Edith, adding more quickly. "And don't take too long, I might need some help." Edith exhaled quietly, already resigned. "Sure." The moment they stepped inside the house, Alice disappeared upstairs without hesitation, her mind already entirely set on preparing for the evening. Meanwhile, Edith and Jasper gathered the rest of the family in the living room, where the discussion that followed stretched on for nearly half an hour. Rosalie spoke the most, her voice sharp as she laid out her concerns. "We know almost nothing about him," she said, her gaze moving between them. "Not what he truly is, not what he's capable of, and yet he already knows what we are, or at the very least suspects." Samael wasn't like the shapeshifters they knew. The memory of that quiet growl still lingered, along with the sense of danger it had stirred in all of them. Emmett, leaning against the wall just behind her, remained quieter than usual, the tension still present in his posture, even if he tried not to show it. Rosalie continued, her tone no less firm. "And if the Vulturi find out about him, they won't stop to ask questions," she said. "They'll see something unknown, something they can't control, and that alone will be enough to put all of us at risk." The weight of that settled over the room, leaving a brief silence behind it. Esme spoke next. "I've never seen Alice like this before," she said gently, her expression softening. "Not as she is now." Her gaze moved between them as she continued. "Think about how she was before her first vision of him, and how she's been since." A faint, fond smile touched her lips. "It's as though we only knew part of her before," she added quietly. "And now, we're finally seeing the rest. She's happy. Truly happy, and I think we can all see that." Carlyle nodded, and a faint warm smile appeared on his face before he spoke. "I can see it as well," he said. "And I don't think we should dismiss what that means." His gaze shifted between them. "Whatever you felt today," he continued, shifting back to reason, "it was only a moment where something in him felt dangerous or unfamiliar." His expression remained calm. "Before that, none of you noticed anything at all. If Alice hadn't warned you beforehand, would any of you have paid him any attention?" The room fell quiet, though this time the silence felt more settled, and no one voiced any disagreement. "That alone suggests we should be cautious with our assumptions," Carlyle continued. "We should meet him properly, and see how it goes." Esme gave a small nod in agreement. "And regardless of what they choose to call this," she added gently, "for Alice, this is already real. She already sees him as one of us." A quiet understanding settled over the room after that. No one argued. After a moment, Edith spoke. "Alice will probably need help," she said. "She isn't about to do anything simple, not for her first date." A soft smile spread across Esme's face at that. "Well then," she said lightly, a hint of warmth and playfulness entering her voice, "let me be a proper mother and help my daughter get ready for her first date." That eased the tension further, small smiles appearing here and there as the weight of the conversation finally began to lift. Carlyle returned her smile without hesitation. Of course. Alice's room. Alice stood in front of the large mirror, dressed only in her underwear, holding two dresses up against herself as she compared them carefully. Her expression was focused as she shifted slightly, studying how each one looked from different angles. A knock at the door drew her attention. "It's me, darling," Esme said softly. "May I come in?" Alice's face brightened immediately. "Of course." Esme stepped inside, and Alice turned toward her, lifting both dresses again. "Which one is better?" she asked, holding them up expectantly. Esme studied them for a moment, her gaze thoughtful, but before she could answer, Alice suddenly went completely still. Esme paused, watching her quietly as the seconds passed. After a moment, Alice blinked and shook her head slightly. "No." Esme tilted her head with a curious but gentle expression. "What do you mean? Did you see something?" Alice let both dresses fall onto the couch without another glance. "Neither of them will work," she said quickly, already moving toward her wardrobe. "I need something black, or at least darker tones." A soft smile touched Esme's lips. "You saw something about tonight?" "Yes," Alice replied without hesitation. "They don't match his outfit." She turned suddenly, her eyes bright with excitement. "Can I borrow those earrings you bought in Milan? The ones from 8 years ago?" Esme let out a quiet laugh. "I'm not entirely sure which ones you mean," she admitted, "but you can take anything you need." "Thank you." After that, everything moved quickly. Clothes were pulled out, discarded, replaced, until, piece by piece, it all came together. Esme stayed with her, helping where needed, her expression filled with quiet warmth. Seeing Alice like this made her genuinely happy. "I've seen it," Alice said suddenly, studying her reflection, "tonight, how he looks. Mom, he's so handsome." Esme's smile softened even more. "I would have loved him anyway," Alice continued, her voice quieter now, almost thoughtful, "but, he's really unfairly attractive." That drew a soft laugh from Esme. "Now I'm curious," she said with a soft smile. Alice stepped away from the mirror and moved to the center of the room, turning slightly. "How do I look?" Esme's answer came without pause. "Beautiful, dear." Alice's smile brightened instantly. "Thank you, and thank you for helping me." Esme stepped closer. "How could I not?" she said gently. "We all know how important this is to you." Alice's expression softened, and she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around her in a quick, affectionate hug. "Thank you," she said quietly. Then she pulled back slightly, her smile returning with quiet certainty. "You all worry too much," she added. "Samael is going to be good for us. He's not like the wolves." Esme nodded softly. "I know," she said gently. "And I trust your heart, Alice. You wouldn't choose someone who meant us harm." Alice smiled, completely assured. "Of course," she said lightly. "You'll see for yourself." At that moment, the sound of a car approaching reached them. Alice froze for a fraction of a second before lighting up instantly. "He's here." Esme laughed softly at her reaction. "Are you sure I look good?" Alice asked quickly, turning back toward her. Esme smiled, amused. "You look perfect." Together, they stepped toward the window. Outside, a grey Aston Martin had just come to a stop. The door opened, and a man stepped out, tall and striking. He wore a fitted black shirt with the top buttons undone, a tailored charcoal blazer layered over it, and dark trousers that fell perfectly over polished shoes. In his hand, he held a large bouquet of deep red roses. "Samael." Alice's lips parted slightly, her expression softening as she watched him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Esme let out a soft hum as she glanced outside. "You didn't exaggerate." Alice nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed outside. It made Esme let out a quiet chuckle. "Come on," she said gently. "Let's go downstairs." Then, with a soft, teasing warmth, she added, "Let's show him how beautiful you are." Alice nodded quickly, taking the words more seriously than they were meant to, which only made Esme smile more. "Let's go." And together, they left the room, heading downstairs. Chapter 29, Chapter 29 Date, 1. Samael POV. By the time I arrived home, the clock was already nearing 5 in the evening, later than I had originally intended, though the delay had not been without purpose. On the way back, I had taken a brief detour to a flower shop, selecting something that felt appropriate for the occasion before ultimately settling on a large bouquet of deep red roses, their color rich and vivid. That left me with roughly an hour and a half to prepare. By 6:25, everything was ready, and I opened the driver's door and settled into my seat as the engine came to life beneath my hands. The journey took approximately 20 minutes, during which the sky gradually darkened, the fading daylight giving way to early evening as the world around me grew quieter. When the time I arrived, the Cullens house stood illuminated against the dim surroundings, its wide glass walls revealing the warm light from within while faint reflections of the forest still traced across the darker sections of the glass. The structure itself was modern, just as I remembered from the movies, all clean lines and smooth surfaces, elevated slightly above the ground and framed by tall trees, giving it an almost secluded presence. I parked the car and shut off the engine, stepping out into the stillness where everything seemed calm and quiet, though at the same time it was clear to me that the residents of the house had already noticed my arrival. I wasn't focusing on what was happening inside, yet one voice stood out effortlessly. "He's here." Alice's bright and happy voice carried from within the house as she announced my arrival before I had even reached the door, drawing a faint smile from me. I approached the entrance and pressed the doorbell, waiting briefly before movement appeared beyond the glass door. Within seconds, Carlyle came into view and opened it. "You must be Samael," he said, offering a polite and composed smile. "Yes, Dr. Cullen, I am Samael Ashbourne," I replied evenly, inclining my head slightly before extending my hand, which he accepted without hesitation. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm here to pick up Alice." "Nice to meet you as well, Samael," he said. "You've arrived at the perfect time. She'll be down in a moment." His tone remained polite, yet his gaze subtly lingered on me, as though he was observing while making an effort to remain courteous. There was no hostility or suspicion in it, only a quiet sense of interest, as if his attention was driven more by curiosity than anything else. Which only confirmed the theory I had already formed about how much Alice and the others knew about me. Thinking back, there had been a reason for the way I asked Alice out. I wanted to understand, at least to some extent, what she had seen in her vision about me. Normally, she shouldn't have been able to see much, yet the concept of imprinting and the even less understood nature of vampire bonds introduced too many variables to ignore, making it possible that she could see more than expected. So, I was curious. The way I asked her out made it clear that I was aware she wasn't human, while at the same time implying that neither was I. Her reaction had already told me enough to form a theory. She knew I wasn't human, at least that much was clear, and she wasn't troubled by it. At the same time, she didn't seem to understand the full extent of what I was capable of, which suggested that whatever she had seen had been limited. Most likely, she hadn't seen my other forms. Carlyle's reaction only supported that conclusion, and more than that, it suggested that this wasn't something he had learned only recently, because otherwise his response would have been more than simple curiosity. But even that remained a theory. It didn't trouble me, though. If anything, it made things easier, as I was far from ordinary, and if the Cullens had already had time to accept at least the idea of me, even without knowing the full truth, then I had no objections. My attention shifted toward the staircase as I became aware of someone descending, accompanied by that same soft, honey-like scent. Alice. She appeared at the top and began descending with light, effortless steps, her gaze lowered at first as she followed her movement, before lifting gracefully to meet mine. She looked stunning. She wore a dark, fitted dress that fell just above the knee, the fabric soft and fluid as it moved with her, paired with sleek heels that added precision to each step. The deep tones complemented her pale skin perfectly, while her short hair framed her face in soft, deliberate lines. I watched her in silence as she approached, not once looking away. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, I finally spoke. "You look fabulous, Alice." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she continued walking toward me with unharried steps, her eyes locked onto mine as if nothing else in the room existed. There was no need for words, the way her expression softened, the warmth in her gaze, the quiet pull between us spoke far more clearly than anything she could have said. Once she stopped in front of me, I extended the bouquet toward her. She accepted it gently, her fingers brushing mine for the briefest moment before she brought the roses closer, breathing in their scent. Her smile widened. "They're beautiful," she said, her voice warm. "Thank you, Sammy. I'm glad you like them." Her attention returned to me. She didn't even try to hide the way her gaze slowly moved over me, openly admiring. "You look." She began softly, her voice faltering for a moment as her gaze lingered, as though she'd lost her train of thought entirely. A faint smile touched her lips. "No, actually," she murmured, her tone turning warmer, more intimate, "you look incredible." She didn't take her eyes off me as she said it. "Although," she added in a light, almost teasing tone, "maybe just a little too much black." Carlyle smiled faintly and then let out a quiet sigh. "You look perfectly fine, Samael," Carlyle said. "Alice just has very high standards when it comes to fashion." Alice glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, though the teasing in her expression remained. "I'm just helping," she said lightly. A quiet laugh escaped me. "It's perfectly fine, Dr. Cullen," I replied. "I don't mind." Alice's expression brightened immediately. "See," she said, clearly pleased. Carlyle smiled faintly and gave a small nod. "Well then, I won't keep you," he said, "I trust you'll take good care of her. I'll make sure she gets back safely." Carlyle didn't say anything in return and simply nodded once again, stepping slightly back. Turning to Alice, I extended my hand, which she took without hesitation, her fingers fitting effortlessly into mine, her other hand still holding the roses. Together, we walked toward the car. When we reached the passenger side, I opened the door for her, and she gracefully slipped inside. "Would you like me to place the flowers in the back?" I asked, glancing at the bouquet. She shook her head, holding them a little closer. "No," she said, "I want to keep them, they smell really nice." A small smile formed. "As you wish," I replied, which earned a soft, pleased hum from her as she settled more comfortably into her seat with the roses in her hands. I closed her door gently before walking around to my side and taking my seat behind the wheel. As I started the engine, I turned slightly toward her. "Are you ready?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Always." The road stretched ahead in a quiet, steady line, illuminated only by the soft glow of headlights as the evening deepened around us. Inside the car, a calm silence settled between us, not the kind that felt empty or awkward, but the kind where neither of us felt the need to speak, as if simply being there together was more than enough. She sat beside me with the bouquet cradled carefully in her hands, occasionally lifting it slightly to breathe in its scent. More than once, I found my gaze drifting toward her. And then, inevitably, to her outfit. This time, I observed more carefully. The longer I looked, the more apparent it became just how perfectly it matched mine, too perfectly for it to be a coincidence, and it didn't take long to understand that she must have seen something about this evening beforehand. Which left only one question: how much? It made me wonder whether she had seen the entire date, or only fragments of it. And more importantly, what would she have done if I had taken her somewhere that might have forced her to question how much I truly understood about her nature? A restaurant, for example, one of the most typical choices for a first date. A place where she would be expected to eat, to act as though nothing was out of the ordinary. She knew I was aware she wasn't human, but that didn't necessarily mean she believed I knew exactly what she was. Would she have gone along with it and pretended? The thought lingered briefly, though as I glanced at her again and noticed how quietly absorbed she was in the flowers, it faded just as easily as it had come. I take it I chose well, I said, nodding slightly toward the bouquet resting in her hands. She looked up at me, her expression lighting up. I love them, she said. I think they might be the prettiest I've ever seen. A quiet breath of amusement escaped me. That sounds like an exaggeration, I replied. Or perhaps you're slightly biased toward the person who gave them to you. Her eyes sparkled with mischief as she tilted her head slightly. Biased, she repeated, feigning innocence. I have no idea what you mean. We held each other's gaze for a moment longer than necessary, though the attempt at maintaining composure didn't last. Almost at the same time, we both let out a quiet laugh. After a bit more driving, the welcoming sign of Port Angeles came into view. When Alice noticed it, her expression shifted slightly, as if she had suddenly remembered something she hadn't meant to bring up, and for a moment, there was a trace of worry in her eyes before she spoke. I'm just curious, she said, glancing at me in a way that tried to seem casual. What did you plan for us tonight? I caught the intention behind the question almost instantly, and the thought crossed my mind that she clearly hadn't seen everything about the evening. A smile almost formed on my face, though I held it back, letting my expression settle into something more neutral. I thought you didn't mind, I replied evenly, or is there somewhere you'd rather not go? She blinked, clearly caught off guard, her gaze shifting away for a moment. No, that's not what I meant, I was just... She stopped mid-sentence the moment she looked back at me again. I was still facing the road, but a faint smile had already formed. And there was unmistakable teasing in it. Her eyes narrowed slightly at first, but then her expression softened into understanding, a hint of amusement appearing as she realized what I was doing. She didn't say anything, just held that knowing look, her head tilting slightly. I still kept my attention on the road, though I glanced at her from the corner of my eyes, and the expression on her face was undeniably adorable. I couldn't hold it in any longer, and a quiet laugh escaped me. She raised an eyebrow. I see you're enjoying yourself, Sammy. Maybe just a little, I admitted, warmth threading through my voice. Sorry, I couldn't resist, but I'd say it was worth it. I paused briefly before adding. Your reaction was very cute. For a moment, her expression softened, clearly pleased, though she quickly composed herself, straightening slightly as a more playful look returned. You won't get away with that so easily, gentlemen. I chuckled quietly. My apologies, I said lightly. I'll have to make it up to you somehow. She held that expression for a moment longer before her lips curved into a small smile. I'll think about it, she said. But you'll have to work hard. Of course. The silence that followed felt different this time, quieter, but carrying something unspoken beneath it. Alice looked down at the flowers in her hands before lifting her gaze back to me, her expression shifting into something more uncertain, as though she wanted to say something but wasn't quite sure how to begin. Sammy, R.Y. Before she could finish, I gently placed my hand over hers, interrupting her. Alice, I said softly, let's leave that for the end of the evening. She searched my face carefully, not looking away. Are you sure? She asked, her voice quieter now. Yes, I replied, offering a small, reassuring smile. You don't need to worry about anything, I added quietly. Just enjoy our first date, all right? She continued to hold my gaze for a moment longer before her hand shifted beneath mine, turning so that our fingers could intertwine. The concern faded from her expression, replaced by something warm, as though whatever had been weighing on her had been quietly lifted. "Okay," she said gently. "We'll do it your way." She adjusted the bouquet slightly so she could hold both it and my hand at the same time, as if unwilling to let go of either. A faint smile remained on my lips as I turned my attention back to the road. 10 minutes later, I slowed the car as our destination came into view. Above the entrance in the building, illuminated against the dim surroundings, a single word was displayed. Cinema. I parked in the nearby lot before stepping out of the car and moving around to her side, opening the door for her. Without hesitation, she handed me the bouquet, which I took in one hand while offering her the other, and she accepted it as she stepped out. Once she was out, I placed the flowers carefully back on her seat and closed the door before turning my attention to her again. "Shall we?" I asked. She nodded, and together we made our way inside, our hands still loosely intertwined. "I have to admit," I said, glancing down at her as we walked, "a cinema isn't exactly the most original choice for a first date, though in my defense, it's not the only thing I have planned for tonight." She looked up at me, her expression softening into a smile touched with playful warmth. "I don't mind," she said. "But I also wouldn't complain if we spent a little more time together after." I met her gaze briefly, returning the smile. "That's fortunate," I replied. At the ticket counter, Alice's attention shifted toward the list of films currently showing, her gaze moving over the options with mild curiosity. "Have you already picked something?" she asked, glancing back at me. "I have," I replied calmly. "And I'm fairly certain you'll enjoy it." It also seemed rather fitting to our situation. Her eyebrow lifted slightly at that, interest immediately sparked. "Is that so?" she said, her tone carrying a quiet curiosity as she studied me. "You sound very confident." "I am," I answered simply, a faint hint of amusement threading through my voice. Within a few minutes, it was our turn. "2 tickets for MR and MRS Smith, please," I said. The girl behind the counter hesitated slightly. "I'm sorry," she said, uncertainty slipping into her voice. "There's been an issue with the projector. That screening has been cancelled for today." Alice pressed her lips together faintly, a small sign of disappointment, before lifting her gaze to watch my reaction. I looked at the cashier, my expression unchanged. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," I said calmly. "I'm the one who called earlier today." The girl's eyes widened slightly. "Are you?" she began, a hint of anxiety slipping into her tone. "Yes, Samael Ashbourne," I said before she could continue, cutting in smoothly. "So is everything ready?" Her posture straightened immediately as she tried to compose herself. "Of course, sir," she said quickly. "Everything is prepared. One of my colleagues will guide you to the hall." "Perfect," I replied. "And before that, we'll take one large popcorn as well." "Certainly, sir," she said, already moving to prepare it with noticeable haste. "Thank you." Beside me, Alice remained quiet, though her curiosity was clear, her gaze shifting between the cashier and me with growing interest as if she was piecing things together but holding her questions for now. A moment later, a member of staff approached and began leading us down the corridor. Alice then leaned slightly closer to me as we walked. "Did you buy all the tickets or something?" she asked quietly. "How did you even do that so fast? They would have had to cancel everyone, that's not exactly ideal for their reputation." Her voice was of a genuine curiosity, though there was something lightly amused beneath it. I glanced at her, a small smile forming. "Let's just say," I replied, a small smile forming, "the owner of this place changed quite recently, and the new one is much easier to work with." Her eyes widened slightly as the implication settled in. "And when exactly did that happen?" she asked, tone shifting into a more playful one. "Oh, not long ago. Roughly a couple of hours." "I see," she said, entertained. "Then whoever that was must have been a very kind person." Exceptionally, I agreed. I think you'd like him. She tilted her head slightly, studying me with a knowing look as her smile slowly deepened. I think I already do. By the time she finished speaking, we had reached the entrance to the hall. The staff member stepped aside, gesturing for us to enter. And without another word, we stepped inside. Hello, everyone. The next chapter might take a bit longer to finish. I have several deadlines coming up, and I don't want them to affect the quality of the chapters. Chapter 30, Chapter 30 Date, 2. Once we stepped into the hall, I guided us toward the middle row. There were no private or VIP sections, but that was enough. From the moment she stepped out of the car, Alice had been holding my hand, her fingers laced with mine. Only when we moved between the narrow rows did she let go, her touch lingering just a second longer before slipping away. When we reached our seats, I let her sit first, then took my place beside her, settling to her right with the popcorn resting on my lap. Then I turned slightly toward her. Alice had already made herself comfortable. Her arm lay along the shared armrest, palm facing up, fingers slightly curled, as if she had been waiting. When she caught me looking, she tilted her head and gave me a small, expectant look, clearly asking what was taking me so long. I let out a quiet breath of amusement and placed my hand over hers, letting our fingers slide together naturally. She reacted right away, a soft smile forming as she leaned closer, closing the small space between us until her head rested lightly against my shoulder. It didn't take long before the lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life, the film beginning to play out in front of us. For a while, we simply watched, though it didn't take long for her free hand to find mine. Her fingers started tracing slow, absent-minded patterns across the back of it. The touch was light, almost careless, her movements without any real rhythm. The sensation caught me off guard, a faint shiver running through me before something I hadn't felt in a long time surfaced again, goosebumps. I almost didn't recognize it at first, and yet now, under something as simple as her touch, it returned. It was strange, calming, but with a quiet spark beneath it. At some point, though, it seemed that holding hands alone wasn't enough for her. I felt her shift slightly beside me, her attention moving to the armrest between us as she touched it lightly at first, then with a bit more intent, testing it. A faint crease formed between her brows when it didn't move, and I caught the small hint of disappointment in her expression. Without saying anything, I lifted our joined hands away from it, and as my free hand moved toward the armrest, she seemed to realize what I was about to do. "It's fine," she began softly, "I think it's..." She didn't get to finish. My hand closed around the base of the armrest, and with a short, dull crack, it gave way. The wood broke under my grip with almost no resistance, and with a single, effortless motion, I tore it free before placing it casually on the empty seat beside me. When I looked back at her, Alice was staring at me, her eyes wide, clearly caught off guard. I met her gaze calmly and gave a small smile. "It's better this way, isn't it?" For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze flicking between me and the now empty space before returning again. Then the surprise faded, replaced by a bright, amused smile, her eyes lighting up with clear enjoyment. "Well," she said lightly, "that's one way to fix it." She shifted closer, this time with nothing between us, settling naturally against me. Her left arm slipped around mine while her right hand remained intertwined with my fingers, as though she had no intention of letting go again. We returned our attention to the film, with only me occasionally reaching into the popcorn. After a while, I felt movement, another hand slipping into the box. I glanced down just in time to see her fingers brush lightly against mine before she picked up a piece and pulled back. A moment later, she lifted it toward me, and I leaned in slightly, accepting it without a second thought. She seemed pleased with that, and after a brief pause, she did it again. And then again. When I turned my head slightly, I noticed how her attention shifted between the screen and me, watching the film while quietly observing my reaction. Her small smile said enough, and I found myself returning it. And just like that, through quiet touches, shared glances, and small gestures, the rest of the film passed by. When the film came to an end, and the final scene faded into black, the credits began to roll across the screen. Soon after, the lights brightened, filling the hall with a soft glow that gently pulled us back to reality. I turned my head toward her, studying her expression briefly before speaking. "So," I asked, a trace of amusement in my voice, "what do you think? Was my confidence of the movie justified?" Alice looked up at me, her lips already curving into a smile. "I liked it." She tilted her head slightly, her smile deepening. "And you're right, it fits a little too well. A dangerously charming couple with secrets." Her gaze lingered on me. "I wonder who that reminds me of." A quiet chuckle escaped me. "I'm glad you approve," I replied lightly, then let my gaze drift toward the exit. "We should get going. It's getting late, and I still have something planned." Her expression shifted instantly, turning teasing. "Oh," she said, raising a brow. "Are you worried about my father's reaction if you bring me home late?" "Not particularly," I answered calmly, meeting her gaze. "But I would prefer to leave a good first impression." She smiled, her eyes bright with playful approval. How thoughtful of you. I'm sure he'll appreciate that." We stood, and without needing to say anything more, made our way out of the hall together. As we stepped back into the main area of the cinema, the girl at the counter straightened slightly when she saw us. "Have a good evening, Mr. Ashbourne," she said politely. I acknowledged her with a small nod and continued toward the exit with Alice at my side. As we walked away, my hearing picked up a hushed voice from the counter. Another employee leaned closer, her curiosity barely contained. "Is that the new boss?" she whispered. "He's so young. And really hot. Next time, let me talk to him," she added quietly. "I have to try my luck." At that exact moment, I felt Alice's hand tighten slightly around mine. I glanced at her, a small smile forming as I noticed the subtle shift in her expression, the faint possessiveness she didn't even try to hide. When we stepped outside, the night had fully settled, the air cooler, the city still alive but quieter than before. Streetlights cast long reflections across the pavement, a few cars passing by while small groups of people walked along the sidewalks, their voices carrying faintly through the evening. "You know," I said casually as we made our way toward the car, my tone carrying a subtle implication, "I could always ask the new owner to reconsider a few staff decisions." Alice looked up at me, her eyes sparkling. "Oh," she said lightly. "Do you think she has a chance?" I raised an eyebrow. "None." Her smile softened, satisfied. "Then I suppose there's nothing to worry about." We reached the car, and I opened the door for her. She slipped inside, and I closed it gently before moving around to the driver's side. A moment later, the engine came to life, and we pulled out of the parking lot. While driving, our conversation drifted from the film into lighter, more personal topics. Small details, preferences, habits, nothing too deep, yet enough to reveal more with each exchange. Outside, Port Angeles moved past us, headlights gliding along the road while the occasional passerby lingered beneath streetlights or near late-open cafes. It wasn't late enough for the town to sleep. Soon, the lights began to fade behind us, replaced by darker roads lined with dense forest. The world grew quieter, the hum of the engine blending with the stillness around us. After some time, I glanced at her. "Shouldn't you at least pretend to be scared?" I asked lightly. She turned her head toward me, a hint of confusion in her expression. "The man you met only a few days ago," I continued, "is now driving you into the middle of the forest at night. That's usually how these horror stories begin." She chuckled softly. "A normal girl might have started worrying the moment you tore that armrest off like it was nothing." I let out a quiet laugh. That's fair. But I suppose I'm not a very normal girl, she added, her voice softer now, her gaze steady on mine. And I believe you would never harm me. I met her gaze. Never. The road ahead narrowed further, the forest closing in until it suddenly opened into a small clearing. I brought the car to a stop, the engine falling silent as the night settled around us. We stepped out, and I moved to the back, opening the boot and retrieving the folded blanket. The place isn't too far, I said, glancing toward the trees. But we'll need to move quickly if we don't want to miss it. Her expression shifted instantly, curiosity lighting her eyes. Miss what? You'll see soon. My gaze dropped briefly to her heels before returning to her face. And I'd rather not ruin those. She followed my glance, then looked back at me, a playful tilt to her head, her lips curving faintly. And what do you suggest, Sammy? I stepped closer without answering, tucking the blanket securely under my arm. She simply watched me, clearly intrigued. Then, in one smooth motion, I lifted her into my arms. Her hands instinctively rose to rest around my neck as I held her securely in a princess carry. Her eyes locked onto mine, surprised, but not resisting. If anything, there was something else beneath it, anticipation. Let's run, I said quietly. And then I did. At first, I kept the pace controlled, moving swiftly through the forest, my steps steady as I navigated between trees and uneven ground with ease. The forest was dense, branches and shadows weaving together, yet none of it slowed me down. Within seconds, I increased my speed, the ground passing beneath us faster and faster until it blurred into motion, my pace far beyond anything human. Alice noticed. Her gaze moved across the surroundings at first, taking in the speed, the movement, the way everything shifted around us, but soon, her attention settled fully on me. I felt it, the way she studied my face, searching for any sign of strain. There was none. My breathing remained steady, unchanged, as if the speed meant nothing at all. After a moment, I glanced slightly upward, then back at her. We have less time than I thought, I said calmly. I'll need to go a bit faster. Her eyes widened slightly. You can. A faint smile formed. Then I accelerated. The wind rushed past us, stronger now, the trees dissolving into streaks of shadow and motion. Despite the speed, my movements remained smooth and steady enough that she stayed completely comfortable in my arms. Eventually, the forest began to thin. The trees gave way as we approached the edge of the forest, the open space revealing itself ahead. I slowed, stepping out into the clearing. I didn't set her down immediately. The soil was still soft, and her heels would sink into it. Instead, I carried her a few steps further, onto firmer ground, before carefully placing her down. Her hands lingered around my neck for a moment longer before she let go. I hope that wasn't uncomfortable, I said, glancing at her. Uncomfortable, she repeated softly, a quiet, almost amused disbelief in her voice. Sammy. I barely felt the difference. If not for the trees, I would have thought you only ran a couple of 100 meters on flat ground. Her reaction made me smile. I tilted my head slightly toward the clearing, and her attention finally shifted past me. The view opened fully before her. We were on a cliff, standing close to its edge. The ocean stretched endlessly below, dark waves moving slowly under the night sky, blending seamlessly into the distant, endless horizon. The world felt still, almost untouched. We moved to a better spot, and I unfolded the blanket, spreading it out before sitting down and offering her my hand. She took it without hesitation, and we settled together. Her gaze remained fixed on the view. It's beautiful, she said quietly. It would be even more beautiful if the moon was out, I replied, a smile forming. But this is exactly what we need. She raised an eyebrow slightly, curiosity returning. Now, I said softly. She looked at me, confused, but then I gently lifted my hand, guiding her chin upward. Her gaze followed. At first, there was nothing but the dark sky. Then, light. It appeared slowly at first, a faint shimmer in the distance, almost easy to miss. But then it grew, spreading across the sky in soft, flowing ribbons. Emerald green unfolded first, blending into shades of violet and pale blue, the colors moving like living silk, shifting and bending in silent waves above us. Alice didn't speak. She simply watched, her eyes wide, completely drawn in. "Sammy," she murmured softly, almost breathless, "this is unreal." She leaned into me without hesitation, and I wrapped an arm around her waist, holding her close as we watched the lights move across the sky. For a while, we spoke quietly, pointing out shapes, how the colors shifted, how they seemed almost alive, changing with every passing moment. "It looks like it's breathing," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. "Or like it's watching us," I replied lightly. She smiled at that, her gaze never leaving the sky. After some time, a quiet silence settled between us. I glanced at her, a small thought crossing my mind, and a quiet laugh escaped me. She looked at me immediately, curious. "What?" "I'm just wondering," I said, turning my head slightly toward her, "what would you have done if I had actually taken you to a restaurant?" She hesitated, her expression shifting slightly as she considered it. "That wouldn't have been easy," she admitted, a small, almost sheepish smile forming. "I would have had to be creative." I laughed quietly, trying to imagine it. A brief silence followed before she looked at me again, more serious this time. "Sammy, how much do you really know about me?" "About what I am?" I looked at her, my expression softening. "First," I said gently, tapping her nose lightly, "you're not what?" "You're who?" She stilled slightly. "I don't know what you call yourselves," I continued calmly, my gaze steady on hers, "but I do know that you're a very beautiful, and very captivating vampire." She stared at me, clearly caught off guard. "And that doesn't concern you?" "It might have," I replied, "if you had a habit of hunting humans." My gaze drifted to her eyes. "But the color of your eyes tells me you don't." "You haven't for a while. And the fact that you can be around people so easily while avoiding it." I paused slightly. "That tells me this isn't new for you." "It's everything I need to know." She remained quiet for a moment, processing, before finally asking, "How do you know so much?" I tilted my head slightly, a faint smile forming. "Is that really the question that interests you the most right now?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Your turn," I said. "What do you know about me?" She hesitated briefly. "Not much, to be honest," she admitted, then added, "Do you know that some of us have gifts?" I nodded and then spoke. "And you're one of them." "Mine allows me to see the future." I exhaled quietly. "That's not something you hear every day. But it explains a lot." "It's not perfect," she added. "I only see things when decisions are made. There are many possibilities, and there are blind spots." Her gaze lingered on me. "You had many of them." I raised an eyebrow. "And yet you knew I wasn't human." She lifted her hand and pointed behind my back. It took me a second before it clicked. "You saw them." She nodded, then added a little more carefully, "My family knows too. Edward can read minds, he saw my vision of you." I felt her hesitation, the slight guilt in her expression. My hand around her waist tightened just a little as I leaned closer. "Do you feel bad that they know about me?" I asked softly. She nodded slightly. I smiled warmly, leaning in until our foreheads touched lightly. "Do you really think I would expect you to hide something like that from your family? Especially before we even met?" She looked up at me. "Do you know how adorable you are?" I added quietly. Her worry faded almost instantly, replaced by something softer. Our gazes held, then slowly drifted to each other's lips. The distance between us closed without words, and when our lips finally met, the kiss was soft at first, gentle, testing, a simple press of lips that lingered with tender pressure. Her hands slowly moved to my face, fingers slipping into my hair as she leaned closer, and I felt her shift, her body turning until she was sitting across my thighs. My hands moved along her waist and up her back, pulling her closer as the kiss grew more intense, more certain. Our lips molded together, sliding softly against each other in unhurried pace, hers parting just enough to brush mine, then closing again. She nipped at my lower lip gently, drawing a low hum from my throat, before pressing her mouth fully to mine once more, sucking softly in a way that coaxed me to respond. I angled my head, capturing her upper lip between mine, tugging lightly. Her fingers tightened in my hair, holding me steady as she mirrored the movements, her lips yielding and then claiming in a rhythm that built slowly, like a quiet flame, each press and release igniting a subtle warmth that spread through us. Time blurred. When I finally slowed, pulling back slightly, she looked at me with clear frustration at the interruption, but then she noticed my eyes. The golden glow behind the lenses was far stronger now, impossible to hide, and the breath leaving my lips was warmer than before, faintly visible in the cool air. "Alice," I said quietly, my voice lower, "it's getting harder to hold back." Her expression softened immediately, understanding and something deeper in her gaze. She gently pushed me back until I lay on the blanket, then settled beside me, her head resting on my chest as my arm wrapped around her waist. "I understand," she said softly, then added with a faint, playful note, "even though I might want you to lose that control at some point. It's probably too much for a first date, don't you think, darling?" The glow in my eyes slowly began to fade as I smiled, letting my head rest back. That made her laugh softly. We stayed like that for a while, lying together, watching the aurora move across the sky in silence. After some time, she spoke again, her tone light. "So, are we official?" I looked at her. "Of course we are," I replied, leaning in to kiss her again, softer this time, shorter, but no less meaningful. She pulled back slightly, her eyes bright. "Then I'm calling you darling from now on." I raised an eyebrow. "Do you refuse to use your privilege of calling me Sammy?" "Of course not," she said quickly, then paused, thinking. "I'll use both, only I get to call you Sammy." I chuckled softly. "I thought I'd made that clear already." "You did," she said with a small, satisfied smile, before leaning in to kiss me again. Chapter 31. Chapter 31. Date, 3/3. The aurora shifted above us, its colors softly bleeding into one another as we lay side by side on the blanket. After a comfortable silence, Alice turned her head, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know," she began, "I don't think I've ever said this before, but it feels unfair. You seem to know so much about my nature, yet I feel like I know almost nothing about yours." She paused. I smiled. "And how does that feel? Not knowing?" "I like it as much as I don't," she admitted. "It's interesting, but there's an uncertainty I'm not used to. My gift usually gives me far more than I saw about you. You had a lot of blind spots." "All right," I said, turning slightly toward her. "Let's make it fair. What assumptions did you and your family make about me?" She pushed herself up onto one arm, leaning over me slightly, her expression thoughtful. "I spent a long time looking through mythology, old manuscripts," she began. "The closest comparisons I could find were an eagle shifter, a harpy, or..." She hesitated. "An angel." The last word lingered in the air between us, and a small, involuntary smile formed on my lips. "I didn't bring that one up with my family," she added quickly. "At first, I was completely sure you weren't one, but when I learned your name is Samael, Her voice softened. I started to wonder.
We're almost
It
there.
was
Keep it
reasonable.
up. UAV
If I were
online.
truly an angel, it would make real things most people preferred to keep abstract: God, heaven, the soul. There may be a certain comfort in believing, but knowing it is something else entirely. Confirmation wouldn't simply challenge their understanding of what I was, it would collapse every quiet assumption they had made about the nature of existence itself.
Keep on them. We're winning this
No,
one.
I said gently. I'm not an angel. The name is coincidence, nothing more. Something in her expression eased. Good, she murmured, more to herself than to me. A brief silence settled, but her curiosity soon surged back, even brighter than before. So, she said, tilting her head, are you like them? The wolves. I glanced at her. You mean the shapeshifters? She blinked, then smiled faintly. Right, shapeshifters. A small pause. So, are you one? I exhaled softly, searching for the simplest way to explain. Yes, and no. She stared at me for a moment, then let out a soft laugh. That's not a very helpful answer. I know. A smile touched my lips. What I mean is, I don't simply shift into a different animal. It's more than that. And I think you've already noticed some of the differences. Her expression lit up instantly. Yes. You're incredibly fast, she said, sitting up straighter. Even I have trouble moving that quickly through the forest, and you didn't even. She gestured vaguely. Shift. I nodded slightly. That's one difference. The other has more to do with the nature of what I shift into. She leaned forward, completely engaged. When you mentioned an eagle, I continued, you weren't entirely wrong. I could almost see the gears turning in her mind. So, partially eagle, she said, testing the idea. She went quiet, her gaze briefly unfocused, then her eyes widened. Wings, eagle. She stopped. A griffin. She straightened up fully, excitement breaking through. You're a griffin. You have to be, that explains everything, the growl, the speed, and it means you're part lion too, aren't you? The speed of her deductions, the brightness in her eyes, it was impossible not to enjoy. I can see you like that idea, I said, smiling. But, no, I'm not a griffin. Yet, I added, I am very close to one. A griffin is half eagle and half lion, I said. But in my case, one side dominates the other, more in terms of form than nature. It appears less often in mythology, though you might find it under a few names. I paused. Vapula, Tyrolean, or the Lion of St. Mark, which is the most recent reference I came across. The first name meant nothing to her. But with each one that followed, her expression shifted, recognition gathering slowly. I prefer something simpler, I said. Winged lion describes what I am well enough. She stared at me for a moment. You're a lion. A winged lion. Right. A quiet laugh escaped her. A winged lion. Then, softer, wow. She paused, then tilted her head. Is that what you meant, then? That you're not like those wolves? I shook my head. Partly. You mentioned seeing my wings in your visions. But tell me, can the wolves transform only part of their body? She thought about it, then shook her head. No. From what I know, they can't. A slight tension crept into her expression. We're not exactly on good terms with them, she added quietly. Don't worry, I said, catching it immediately. Whatever stands between your family and the wolves has nothing to do with me. That we share a similar nature doesn't mean we share the same side. The tension vanished. She smiled and leaned in, resting against the curve of my neck, and without thinking, I tightened my arm around her. So, I said after a moment. Let me show you another difference. I raised my free hand between us, palm upward. Watch. Her gaze dropped to it immediately. At first, nothing. Then, Slowly, my nails darkened and lengthened, curving into large, sharp claws. My hand grew slightly larger, fur rising in a soft, dense layer across the back. Wow, she breathed, and reached out instinctively. I drew my hand back slightly. Careful, I warned. They're sharp. Very sharp. She stilled. What struck me was that she didn't test it, she simply trusted me. I hadn't expected that. She had spent her entire life in a body that could shrug off almost anything, and old habits like that usually didn't pause for a quiet warning. But she had. She reached out again, slowly this time, and took my hand carefully in both of hers, turning it over with open, unhurried fascination. The skin is so tough, she murmured, but it isn't rough at all. No, I agreed, and that's not all. The transformation continued, spreading up my forearm. My hand grew larger, its shape shifting into something closer to my Winglion form, only smaller. Alice ran her fingers slowly over the fur. Then she stilled, a shift in her expression. After a moment, she glanced up at me. May I? I understood immediately. One moment. One of the few advantages of that form was the ability to retract my claws fully. She watched them disappear, eyes wide, then let out a soft, delighted giggle. I really need to get used to the fact that my boyfriend is a lion, she said. A winged lion. Right. The corner of her mouth curved. A winged lion. My sincerest apologies. Without further ceremony, she brought my hand to her face and pressed her cheek into the fur, closing her eyes. She moved slowly, unhurried, clearly just enjoying the sensation. It's so soft, she said quietly, almost to herself. Then, after a moment, and so warm. Her eyes opened again, a thoughtful look settling in her expression. Before, she said, I couldn't smell anything particular from you. But the moment you transformed. She paused. Now I can. I raised an eyebrow. And? She lifted a finger to her lips, considering. It's nothing like the wolves, she said finally, after a moment of thought. Nothing sharp or unsettling. It's warm and grounding somehow. She glanced at me. And there's something wilder underneath that I can't quite place, but it's not unpleasant. Not at all. So you like it, I said. She smiled. I do. We were sitting now, facing the ocean. Alice had been telling me about her family. She told me how she had found them, a vision of herself among them, a future she had chosen to walk toward before she even understood what it was. She had gone to them without memory of who she had been before, only the certainty of where she was supposed to be. We call ourselves vegetarians, she said, a faint trace of irony in her voice. We only drink animal blood. She paused, then added more quietly, unfortunately, it doesn't bring real satisfaction. It only makes the absence of human blood easier to bear. I didn't say anything immediately. There was nothing to add. After a moment, she tilted her head, gazing at the sky. What does it feel like? She asked. To fly. I followed her gaze upward, considering how to put my intentions into words, but then I stopped. Why describe it, I said, when I can show you. Realization dawned on her face as she turned to me, and she was on her feet before I finished the thought. Yes, she exclaimed. Yes, absolutely. I rose slowly, and my fingers moved to the buttons of my shirt, undoing them one by one. Alice didn't speak, her eyes following the rise and fall of my chest as my shirt parted. They lingered on the lines of muscle beneath as the fabric slid from my shoulders. I laid the shirt on the blanket and glanced back at her. She hadn't moved, her gaze fixed on my bare torso as if she'd forgotten everything else. I stepped closer. Gently, I reached out, my fingers grazing her jaw before lifting her chin, guiding her eyes up to mine, though it took her a noticeable moment to pull them away. Still want to fly? I asked. She nodded, then seemed to catch herself. Not that I'm against any of this, she said, but why did you take your shirt off? It's a bit distracting. I smiled. We're not in a fairy tale, dear. The shirt wouldn't survive if I released my wings. Her eyes widened slightly. That makes sense, she said. I thought so. Then my wings emerged from my back in a single motion, vast and golden white, each feather catching the faint, shifting light of the aurora above. Even folded, their span changed the feel of the space around me. Alice took a small step back, but then immediately stepped forward again, her hand reaching out, fingers moving slowly along the edge of one wing, tracing the feathers with careful, unhurried wonder. She looked up at me. I thought. She shook her head slightly. I thought they couldn't be more beautiful than in my vision. A pause. I was so wrong. I let her linger for a moment, then said, "Let's go, dear," and swept her up before she could protest. Oh! Her arms went around my neck instantly, her expression a mix of indignation and anticipation. "Ready?" I asked. She nodded quickly. I unfolded my wings to their full span, close to 5 meters from tip to tip, bent my knees, and pushed off the ground. We rose sharply into the cool air, and then I beat my wings in long, steady strokes, lifting us higher above the cliff edge, above the tree line, into the open sky. The wind moved differently up here, not the static cool of the clearing below but something alive, shifting in currents I felt through every feather. I climbed steadily, angling toward the cloud layer that had softened the aurora from below. Then we broke through the surface, and the world opened. Above the clouds, the aurora ceased to be a filtered view. It danced directly overhead, so close it felt less like a natural phenomenon. Beneath us, the cloud layer stretched like still water, and in the distance, the scattered lights of Port Angeles winked through the breaks, small and quiet against the dark coast. Alice said nothing. She gazed at the view for a long moment, arms still wrapped around my neck. Then she turned to me and, without a word, kissed me, deeply and unhurriedly, her fingers pressing lightly at the back of my neck. When she pulled back, she wore a smile I hadn't seen before. "Thank you," she said quietly. "This is more than I could have dreamed for a first date." A warm feeling settled in my chest. "Then I'll have to keep setting the standard," I said. "There will be many more." Her smile widened. "Yes." She hugged me tighter, resting her head against my shoulder. "Yes, there will." We lingered above the clouds for a long while. I steered us south along the coast, our altitude rising and falling with the currents, the ocean occasionally visible through gaps in the cloud cover. Once, I brought us low, skimming just above the treeline, the rush of cold air sharp and immediate, before climbing again. By the time we turned back north, the lights of Forks had appeared in the distance, pale and familiar against the surrounding darkness. "I should take you home," I said. She sighed softly. "I know," she said, and tightened her arms around me, reluctant to let me go. We began our descent. Chapter 32, Chapter 32 Talk. General POV. Samael landed 50 meters from the house and gently set Alice on the grass. She kept her arms around his neck for a moment, then pulled him down for a kiss. When she broke away, she was already smiling. "Weren't you worried about first impressions, darling?" He raised an eyebrow. "You do realize vampires have excellent eyesight," she continued, tilting her head. "And you just landed near our house, shirtless." Instead of answering, he studied her. "Then answer me this," he said calmly. "Why would I fly low over Seattle earlier, when my wings are so visible even at night?" Realization dawned on her, replacing amusement with surprise. "I didn't think of that," she admitted, her voice quieter. "But then, how?" He smiled, pressed a last kiss to her lips, and stepped back, walking away slowly while facing her. When they were about half a meter apart, his body began to fade, his outline softening and dissolving into the darkness. His face was barely visible when his voice reached her. "Camouflage, baby," he said, smiling from the fading silhouette. "I'll pick you up in the morning." Then he disappeared. Alice remained, processing what she'd just seen. The surprise gave way to quiet delight, and she laughed softly. "You are incredible, darling," she murmured to the empty space before she turned and walked toward the house. High above, Samael hung in the air over the house, his wings moving in long, slow strokes, holding him in place effortlessly. He watched the door close behind her and remained where he was. He had no real desire to leave, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. The closer he got to Alice, the harder it was to stay away. He shook his head. He had to get the car back. He pulled his wings in and beat them hard to move off, but the stroke came out stronger than he had intended, sharp enough to surprise even him. He glanced back toward the house for a moment. Then he dismissed it and turned south, picking up speed in the direction of the car. Alice entered through the front door and headed straight upstairs, her mind still somewhere above the clouds. She turned the corner on the second-floor landing and stopped short. 3 figures were waiting. Esme stood slightly ahead of the others, her posture composed, but her expression held a firmness that immediately caught Alice's attention. It wasn't anger, not exactly, but it was far from the gentle warmth Alice had expected. Beside her, Rosalie stood with arms loosely folded, wearing the same composed expression she reserved for anything involving Bella or Samael. Edith leaned against the wall with a small, barely contained grin, clearly enjoying the situation. Alice looked at Esme. "Mom? What's wrong?" "What's wrong," Edith said pleasantly, before Esme could answer, "is that you seem to have had quite a night. So much so that you forgot you'd promised to check your messages." Our dear mother was beginning to worry. Her tone dripped with amusement. Alice winced. "I forgot." "You forgot," Esme repeated. "But everything was fine," Alice said. "We had a wonderful time. There was nothing to be concerned about." Esme watched her closely, the concern in her gaze easing slightly but not disappearing entirely. "I know it may seem unnecessary," she said carefully, choosing her words, "but we don't know much about him and what he can do." Her expression softened further as she added, "And you were out there alone." "I do know," Alice said. "Maybe not everything yet, but enough. He isn't dangerous." "Not to me." "You've known him for barely any time at all," Rosalie pointed out. Alice looked at her evenly. "And yet here I am. Home, safe, and happier than I've been in a long time." She let that sit for a moment before adding, "Trust me on this one." Rosalie held her gaze for a moment, then looked away without comment. Esme studied Alice's face and exhaled slowly. "I'm glad you're home. That's all." Esme said quietly and pulled her into a hug. Alice smiled and hugged her back. Rosalie spoke up as Alice pulled back. "I didn't hear a car. How did you get home?" Alice opened her mouth, and then the sound hit. To a human, it would have been nothing, a brief rush of wind outside, easily ignored. But to every vampire in the house, it registered as something far more distinct, a deep, forceful displacement of air directly above the roof. Every one of them went rigid, except for Alice, who tilted her head up toward the ceiling with a quiet, delighted laugh. Rosalie's eyes slowly returned to her. "What," she said, "was that?" Alice's smile widened, a quiet satisfaction settling into her expression. "The answer to your question, dear sister." 15 minutes later, everyone had gathered in the living room. The hour was late, and the atmosphere carried a faint echo of their recent such assembly, when Samael had first arrived in Forks. A low, rectangular glass coffee table sat at the center. 2 sofas faced each other across it, flanked on the remaining sides by 2 leather couches. Alice sat on one sofa with Esme to her left and Edith to her right. Jasper and Emmett occupied the sofa opposite them. Carlyle settled onto one of the leather couches, and Rosalie positioned herself beside Emmett, her hand in his. Only Edward was absent. They still carried some tension from the sound above the house. Alice had offered no further insight yet, and the room had been waiting. It had been Esme who suggested they gather properly and discuss it together in one go, and the others had agreed. Now, all eyes settled on Alice. Carlyle looked between her and Esme for a moment, then said quietly, "So, what was it?" Alice exhaled softly. "Most likely him," she said. "Samael?" Carlyle asked. She nodded and then smiled in the way that meant she had been looking forward to telling them. "You remember I mentioned he has wings?" Emmett leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Okay, but, wings? We're talking about wings." "Yes," Alice said patiently. "On a person?" "On him, yes." Emmett sat back. "All right. All right, I'm with you. Keep going." "Edith, quiet until now," said Alice, her tone careful. "Are we certain he's a shapeshifter?" "Because given the name." "He's a shapeshifter," Alice said, cutting her off cleanly. "I know what you're all thinking, and the answer is no. He told me himself. He isn't an angel." Relief was visible on more than one face. "Then what is he?" Carlyle asked. Alice smiled, clearly looking forward to this part. "A winged lion." Emmett stared at her. "I'm sorry," Emmett said. "A what?" "A winged lion," Alice repeated, entirely unbothered by his expression. "That's how he described himself. He said it's the most accurate and simplest way to put it." "I've genuinely never heard of that," Emmett said, looking around as though hoping someone else would confirm it. "Neither have I," Edith admitted. Carlyle was already getting to his feet. "I might have something," he said, disappearing down the hall. He returned a minute later with a book, setting it open on the glass table. The page showed a detailed illustration, a great lion, wings folded behind it, one forepaw resting on an open book. Alice leaned forward immediately. "That's it. That's exactly what he described." "The Lion of St. Mark," Carlyle said. "The symbol has roots in early Venetian tradition, though similar figures appear across several cultures under different names. It significantly predates the Christian association." He paused, studying the image. "Traditionally, it's understood as simply a winged lion, not a hybrid like a griffin." "He'd disagree," Alice said. Carlyle looked up. "He told me he feels very close to griffins," she explained. "The difference is that his eagle features are only the wings, his form is otherwise entirely lion. But he doesn't think that makes him any less of either. He said the eagle is part of him, not just in what he can do, but in how he experiences himself." Edith frowned slightly. "How is that meaningfully different from the Lion of St. Mark?" "His sight, for instance," Alice said. "He has eagle vision. He can see clearly across tens of miles the same way humans can see something right in front of them." Then the questions came: how strong? What is he capable of? Alice answered what she could, admitting plainly that there was much she didn't know. She had only discovered the truth herself a few hours ago. Everyone accepted that without pushing. It was enough for them, at least for now. Then Edith asked about the date, and the tone of the room shifted entirely. Alice's face lit up. She described the flight, how he had taken off from the cliff edge. She described breaking through the cloud layer, the aurora directly overhead, and below them the clouds spread out flat and still like a second ground, with the scattered lights of Port Angeles far below. She recounted how he had brought them low over the treeline on the way back, the rush of it, and then climbed again into the quiet above. The girls were completely drawn in. Edith, Esme, and even Rosalie leaned forward, questions coming one after another: what it felt like, how high they had gone. Alice happily answered every single one, and that part of the conversation went on for quite some time. By the time it wound down, the tension that had opened the evening was long gone. Not every question had been answered, there were still things none of them knew, and things Alice didn't know either. But enough had been said, and when they finally dispersed, things felt considerably more settled than they had when the night began. Samael POV. I took back my shirt, found the car, and drove home. After a quick meal, I went straight to bed, and I won't pretend my reasoning was anything other than simple. The sooner I slept, the sooner morning would arrive, and morning meant Alice. When I woke, I lay still for a moment, then something drew my attention to the pillow I slept on. I turned toward it and breathed in slowly. Alice. Her scent lingered there, a honeyed warmth mixed with a trace of her perfume, probably caught in my hair when she'd held it during our kiss. I lay there with my eyes closed for a few more minutes. My thoughts drifted back through the evening, to her, the way she had looked beneath the shimmering sky, bathed in its glow, her eyes soft with a tenderness that mirrored the quiet beauty of the night. The kiss. The softness of her lips against mine, the way she had drawn me closer without a whisper of doubt. Several minutes slipped by before the memory gently eased its grip. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I already suspected who it was. Alice, good morning, darling. I'm waiting for you. Alice, you remember the address, right? Samael, good morning, honey. I do. I'll be there in an hour. Alice, great. Love. 40 minutes later, I pulled up to the Cullens house and cut the engine. I got out, leaned back against the car with my hands in my pockets, and waited. A typical Forks morning, low clouds, everything damp, grey, and quiet. Before Alice appeared, the garage door opened. 2 cars emerged, one after the other, a red Mercedes cabriolet and a Jeep. The girls were in the cabriolet. They didn't stop, but Edith gave me a brief nod as they passed, which I returned. Something was different about the way they looked at me, though. Before, it had been mostly assessment, measuring, with little caution and a particular edge of suspicion from Rosalie. Today, that was mostly gone. They were calmer, and their eyes held something closer to recognition. Alice had clearly spoken with them. We had discussed what she could share and what was better left unsaid, at least for now. It had seemed to matter more to her than to me, which I respected. She had been careful, wanting to ensure she didn't let anything slip that might be important to me, even knowing she didn't have the full picture herself. Part of it, I suspected, was her way of quietly encouraging me to be more open with her. It was thoughtful, more thoughtful than she probably even realized. The Jeep followed, Jasper driving, Emmett standing in the back, which I had no trouble believing was a regular occurrence. He spotted me and grinned. Hey, dude, what's up? I smirked. I'd say you might be overestimating yourself if you think there wasn't enough room inside for you. He laughed. Jasper smiled from the driver's seat. Don't give him ideas. I'm perfectly comfortable in here on my own. You're both hurting me, Emmett said, hand on his chest. I laughed. He pointed at me as the Jeep started moving. See you at school. And treat our sister well. I nodded and watched them clear the driveway. The front door opened behind me. I didn't move, just straightened up and opened my arms. The blur closed the distance in under a second, and then she had her arms around me, face pressed against my chest. Alice looked up at me. I missed you so much. Usually, I said, tilting her chin up toward me, someone would point out that we were only apart for a few hours. I held her gaze for a moment. But I find I agree with you completely. I kissed her, and she returned it. When we broke apart, I said quietly, I missed you too. She smiled, kissed me briefly once more, then stepped back and took my hand. Come on. We'll be late. We drove with our hands resting on the armrest, her fingers loosely intertwined with mine. It seems like you already talked to them, I said after a moment. Was it that obvious? I let out a quiet breath, the corner of my mouth lifting slightly. Rosalie stopped looking at me like I'm personally responsible for the end of the world. That kind of progress doesn't just happen overnight. Alice laughed softly. I told them last night. They weren't going to let me go without some kind of explanation anyway. She paused. But I didn't mind, their worry is understandable. I nodded. I told them about the winged lion part, she continued, and a little about your family. Then her voice picked up energy. And of course, I told them about the flight and everything. You should have seen Edith's face. She paused, clearly pleased with the memory. Even Rosalie forgot to look strict for a moment. I smiled. I imagine Jasper and Emmett are going to have a difficult time in the near future trying to match that. She giggled. For sure they will. A short silence settled between us, and then I asked, so, how did they take the part about my nature? She smiled at the memory. Better than I expected, honestly. And they seemed genuinely relieved that you aren't a famous fallen angel. I laughed quietly. Good. After another comfortable stretch of quiet, Alice said, I just realized, yesterday, when I brought up Edward, you didn't even blink. Most people, knowing someone can hear their every thought, would at least be a little uncomfortable. I smiled at the road. I'd bet he didn't see much of mine. She turned toward me slightly. So, you already knew he couldn't read you. I glanced at her. I have some kind of natural shielding. I always have. I don't entirely understand the mechanics of it, but it works. Her expression suddenly brightened with interest, though her tone carried a playful edge. Sammy, can you share it? She asked. You know, like, extend it. She tilted her head slightly. I wouldn't mind finally having some privacy. I laughed. I'm asking genuinely, she said, though she was smiling. It would be so convenient, having your thoughts actually stay your own. I looked over at her. Honey, if I could, I'd do it without a second thought. I don't like the idea of anyone having access to your thoughts, even if it is your brother. Her expression softened. She leaned over and kissed me on the cheek. Thank you. She settled back into her seat, thoughtful for a moment, before something else seemed to click in her mind. She turned her head toward me again, a small, curious smile forming. So, she said, drawing it out slightly. Honey. I like that. A pause. But is there a reason for it? I smiled faintly. There actually is. That got her full attention. My senses are strong, I said. If I focus, I can pick up every scent from 10 miles, and track something specific much further than that. Smell is almost as important as sight in how I read the world. I paused. Vampires have a very distinct smell to me. Like an artificial sweetener, and not in a good way. It's overwhelming, and the longer you're near it, the more unpleasant it gets. I glanced at her. Yours is different, I said. It's warm and natural. Honey is the closest thing I can compare it to. Calling you that felt like the most accurate thing I could do. She was quiet for a moment. Then, very calmly, Sammy, you can drive without looking directly at the road, right? I furrowed my brows. Yes, why? She suddenly closed the distance and kissed me, with a passion as strong as, or even stronger than, our first kiss. She kept it going until we were almost at the school. She sat back, looked at me, then studied me more carefully. Did you forget your lenses? I blinked. No. I checked the mirror. 2 bright golden orbs stared back at me. I exhaled. Damn. I pulled into the lot, parked, and closed my eyes, focusing until things settled back down. When I opened them again, they were much duller. I looked at Alice. As much as I enjoyed every second of it, we need to be more careful about those. She giggled, Entirely unapologetic. Agreed, she said, and got out of the car. Chapter 33, Chapter 33. Did you? General POV. A typical Forks morning, low clouds, damp air, and the usual uninspired grey sky. In the parking lot, students drifted toward the entrance in loose groups, while others lingered near their cars, stretching out the last few minutes before the bell. Jessica, Angela, Mike, Tyler, and Eric had gathered in their usual spot by Tyler's van. Jessica laughed with the others, though something still felt subtly amiss. It wasn't exactly sadness, she knew there had never been anything real between her and Samael, and she knew that. But being passed over without a second glance still stung, even if she couldn't fully explain why. The feeling was contradictory. Angela noticed her recent mood but remained silent. Eric was mid-sentence when he abruptly stopped. "What?" Mike asked, grinning. "Forget how your own story ends." Eric didn't answer, his expression completely still as he stared toward the far end of the lot. Then Angela, who had already looked in the same direction, said quietly, "No way." Everyone turned. The grey Aston Martin was parked there, a car they all recognized by now. But it wasn't the car that caught them off guard, it was the passenger door swinging open and Alice stepping out. A second later, Samael came around from the driver's side. Silence fell. Eric recovered first. "I mean," he gestured vaguely, "maybe he just gave her a lift." No one responded, still watching. Alice looked up at Samael with a warm, easy smile. She stepped close and took his hand. Samael looked down at her in a similar way, and together they headed toward the entrance. He said something low as they walked, and Alice let out a soft, delighted giggle that carried just far enough to reach the group. Nearly every student in the parking lot had turned to watch them by that point. Tyler watched them disappear through the school doors, blinked once, and turned to Eric. "Yeah, Eric," he said. "Not just a lift." Jessica and Angela stood shoulder to shoulder, looking in the direction Samael and Alice had gone. "Do you think I never had a chance?" Jessica asked without turning her head. "No," Angela said, with the certainty of someone reciting a well-established fact. Jessica turned to look at her. "You could at least pretend to hesitate about it. Best friend. Just so you know." She let out a short, aggrieved huff and went inside. Angela sighed, shook her head, and followed. The boys still stood in silence. "We're doing something wrong, aren't we?" Eric said eventually, but it didn't come out as a question. "Yes," said Mike. "Yeah," Tyler added. Samael POV. We'd lingered at Alice's locker so long before heading to first period that the corridors had nearly emptied. Neither of us had noticed, or cared. When we reached the point where our paths diverged, she stepped in front of me, rose onto her tiptoes, kissed me, then stepped back and continued on her way without missing a beat. I stood there for a moment, watching her go. She glanced back once, winked playfully, and kept walking, a faint smile lingering on my lips for a second longer before I finally turned back the way we had come. The corridor was almost completely empty, maybe 2 minutes until the bell. Instead of heading to class, I stopped, facing down the hall as if waiting. A few seconds passed. I exhaled quietly. "I didn't realize you were into hide and seek," I said calmly. A slight pause. "Bit childish, don't you think, Peter?" From around the corner, Peter emerged, rubbing the back of his neck. "How long have you known I was there?" "Long enough," I said, and turned toward my class. The bell rang the moment I started walking. Peter broke into a jog to catch up and fell into step beside me, immediately launching into a speech he'd clearly been composing for the last 5 minutes. "Okay, so," he started quickly, "I saw you too, and yet, I could have just walked up like a normal person, but there was a whole situation happening. And I read that situation, and it very clearly said do not approach. So I didn't. Which, by the way, was the correct decision. He kept going without slowing. And then you just kept walking, and now we have the same first period, same direction, and I'm stuck behind you like I'm following you on purpose, which I wasn't. Just to be clear. He said all of that without taking a single meaningful breath. Goodness, I said. That was a lot of words. He looked at me. Okay, you know what? No, he said, cutting himself off. Why do I feel like I'm the weird one here? I'm not the guy who shows up, 3 days ago and suddenly starts dating one of the top 5 girls in the entire school. I laughed lightly. Honestly, from that angle, I might understand you. He looked at me like I'd just validated something important. Thank you. That's all I needed. A short pause. She brought you lunch yesterday, too. She did. He nodded slowly. Right, yet. I'm fine. Completely fine. He didn't sound completely fine. The first 2 periods passed without anything noteworthy, and before long, it was time for lunch. Like the day before, the 3 of us ended up at the same table. Alice placed a lunchbox in front of me as promised. I swallowed a piece of steak, then remembered something and glanced at Peter. He'd just bitten into an apple, head turned slightly, watching something across the room. Peter. He looked back at me, still chewing, and gave a small shake of his head as if to say what? I ordered the bike. It'll be here on Saturday. That got his attention immediately. Oh nice. Yeah, we can ride Saturday evening then. Deal. Alice leaned toward me slightly, her tone casual but her intent clear. So you're free Friday after classes, Sammy? I looked at her and nodded. Her smile grew a little. Good. I want you to meet my family. Peter choked, coughing sharply, clearly caught completely off guard. Alice and I both looked at him. You good, man? I asked. He waved a hand, coughing once more until his airway cleared. Yeah. Totally fine. Went down wrong. I held his gaze for a second, one eyebrow raised, but Alice pulled my attention back before I could say anything. So, she asked, looking at me with that expectant smile. Why not? She made a small, delighted sound and leaned in to kiss me on the cheek. I smiled. Across the table, Peter had gone suspiciously quiet, focusing on his food with too much dedication. The shock was still written on him clearly enough, but for once, he kept it entirely to himself. The rest of lunch passed with the familiar undercurrent of glances toward our table, most of which I noticed but ignored. Bella's reaction, however, was clear. She had moved past surprise into genuine bewilderment. Still unsettled from biology, the realization that Alice and I were already together only seemed to compound her reaction. The rest of the school day passed much the same way. The only thing that held any real interest was my time with Alice. We kept to ourselves between classes, away from prying ears, and talked about each other, our perspectives, how we each made sense of the world, the small details that often reveal more about a person than the big ones. After school, I drove her home so she could change, left the car at the Cullens' house, and then the evening was ours. We ended up deep in the forest outside Seattle, high in the branches of a tall pine that towered above the other trees. Far below, a wide river snaked through the darkness, its surface catching and reflecting faint light in slow, shifting patterns. The forest stretched endlessly, quiet and still. Alice sat sideways across my legs, leaning into me, her head resting against my chest. She had both arms loosely wrapped around one of mine. She wore a sleeveless blouse, and my free hand rested against her bare shoulder, slowly tracing gentle movements along her skin. She was telling me about the weeks before we met, about the visions, how they had grown more frequent as the day approached, becoming sharper and more insistent. I didn't know exactly when it would happen, she said, or even how. But the closer it got, the clearer that vision of you became. She paused. And I was worried you wouldn't like me, or that I'd do something reckless and ruin it before it even started. A small, quiet laugh escaped her. My visions change so easily depending on what we do, so nothing was ever certain. I listened without interrupting, my hand slowing as a gentle caress shifted to a light hold on her shoulder. After a moment of quiet, she tightened her arms around mine, holding me more firmly. Sammy, she said softly, I waited for you for so long and was so afraid of losing you, even before we were together. I smiled, a gentle sadness underlying the expression. I brought my other arm around her, drew her closer, and kissed the top of her head. I know, I murmured. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Not ever. She smiled and shifted closer, pressing her head into my chest as if trying to eliminate the last bit of space between us. Still, I sensed a lingering worry, a quiet fear that hadn't quite released its hold. I could see it even now. The more time we spent together, the more clearly I saw her, including the parts quietly shaped by years of solitude. She needed affection, the kind she had gone without for too long, and I wasn't just willing to give it, I was glad to. I let a moment settle between us, then said quietly, the wolf shapeshifters and I share one very particular thing in common. She looked up at me. It's called imprinting. Seeing the word meant nothing to her, I elaborated, in theory, it isn't always romantic, but realistically, it almost always is. Think of it as their version of falling in love, except it happens instantaneously, not gradually. The person you imprint on becomes your entire world, as some fundamental part of you has already decided it. She went completely still in my arms. Did you? She began, her voice slightly unsteady. Yes, I said. The moment I saw you in the cafeteria. Then, smiling, I added, so even if you try, you're not getting away from me, my little pixie. She looked at me for a moment, then shifted fully toward me, wrapping her legs around me as she kissed me with enormous passion. When she pulled back, there was no uncertainty left in her expression. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Never. The last word came out a little louder, as if she wanted the whole forest to take note. I smiled. Eternity, then. Eternity, she said, and we picked up exactly where we left off. Hi all. This chapter is a bit shorter than the recent ones. I'll have to do the same for the next 3-4 chapters, so I don't slow down the update rate. Uni is hitting hard this year. Chapter 34, Chapter 34 Sawmill. General POV. Location, Old Sawmill, Aberdeen, Washington State. 100 miles south of Forks. By 5 in the afternoon, the light was already thinning, the sky growing darker by the minute. Inside the sawmill, Matthew fed a plank through the cutting machine, waited for the noise to subside, and switched it off as the two halves separated. He lifted his protective mask and wiped his forehead with his forearm. It had been a long day. The equipment was old and stubborn, the sawmill barely staying afloat, and today it was just him and old Bill, the same Bill who had worked here for over 30 years and knew every fault of the place better than anyone. Matthew glanced toward the far end of the building. No sign of Bill. He pulled a chair over, sat down, and took out a cigarette and a lighter. He lit the cigarette, drew a slow breath, and let the quiet settle around him for a moment. He hadn't quite finished when Bill's voice echoed from somewhere deeper within the building. Ah! Matthew froze. He shot to his feet, instinctively hiding the cigarette and turning as if to get back to work, but Bill didn't appear. The shouting continued, more desperate now. Stop, please, stop. Why are you doing this? Bill was not a man who frightened easily. 30 years in a place like this had seen to that. But what was in his voice now was fear, and there was no mistaking it. Then, clearly. Matthew. Help. His eyes landed on an axe mounted near the workbench. He grabbed it, and whatever hesitation he had dissolved in a surge of adrenaline. He turned toward Bill's voice and had already taken a step when a voice came from directly behind him. Ah, a boy trying to play the hero. How interesting. He spun around. A woman was standing maybe 10 feet away, and for a moment Matthew forgot entirely what he'd been about to do. Red hair, a face that was almost unsettlingly beautiful, and a faint, cold smile. Her eyes were a deep, vivid red, a color he had never seen in a person's eyes before. Before he could process that, another voice came from behind him. I see you found us another snack, dear. Matthew turned again, axe raised. A shirtless man stood a short distance away, dirty blonde hair falling loosely around his face, head tilted slightly as if mildly entertained. He had the same red eyes. Yeah, the redhead said, stepping closer. Found a little hero all ready to save the old man. Her smile widened, a coldness lurking beneath it. Almost sweet. The shirtless man looked at Matthew. Think that thing's going to help you. He took a slow, unhurried step forward. Don't come any closer. Matthew tightened his grip on the axe, his voice steadier than he felt. He had a weapon, they were empty-handed, and there were only two of them, none of which diminished the cold, deep fear gripping him. Something screamed in the back of his mind. He didn't know why. A third voice, flat and unhurried, came from Matthew's right. James. Victoria. Stop playing with our food. Matthew turned. A black man with long dreadlocks stood at the edge of the room, watching them with mild disinterest. James glanced over with a half-smile. You always ruin the fun, Laron. What happened next was too fast to follow. One moment Matthew had the axe, the next it was gone. Victoria stood beside James, holding it briefly before letting it drop to the floor with a dull thud. We won't be needing that, she said. Then James was directly in front of him. A hand closed around his throat, lifting him off the ground. Matthew swung, tried to pry the grip loose, it was like hitting stone. James watched him with interest. Still trying, he murmured. I like that. Then he caught Matthew's arm and broke his wrist with seemingly no effort, like snapping a dry branch. Matthew couldn't even scream properly with the grip on his throat. Then Victoria and Laron moved in, and the three of them descended on him. Matthew's struggles lasted just a little longer, but not long enough to mean anything to them. When they finally stepped back, Matthew was on the floor, drained dry and left in a state that would raise no difficult questions. An animal attack, most would conclude. Tragic, but not unusual in these parts. 20 minutes later, the three of them stood in the forest, roughly 15 miles north of the sawmill. The last traces of daylight faded between the trees, leaving everything dim and colorless. We're drawing too much attention, Laron said. We should move north to Seattle, a city large enough that a missing person or two won't raise suspicion. James didn't answer, standing still, his gaze drifting unfocused through the trees as if following a private thought. He seemed distant, slightly removed. Laron watched him for a moment, then added, we should also be more selective next time. No family, no friends, so no one will care if they're gone. That seemed to register, eliciting a slight turn of James's head. He looked at Laron, his expression one of mild acknowledgement, as if he had heard the words but hadn't yet decided if they mattered. Whatever Laron said, James would do as he pleased when the time came, and they both knew it. After a moment, he spoke, we'll go north. Laron gave a small nod. Victoria, who rarely hesitated, remained silent. Standing slightly apart, she listened to Laron lay out their course and felt something unnameable settle uncomfortably in her chest. It wasn't quite a thought, nor was it fear, but closer to the unsettling sensation of a foot finding no ground. North. Seattle. The words were ordinary, the logic sound, and yet something within her quietly resisted. She didn't speak, unsure if she could even explain the feeling. In truth, Victoria had never fully understood her own gift, never even considered it as such. She operated on instinct, a subtle internal current that had guided her decisions for years, presenting itself as mere preference. She had simply learned, unconsciously, to trust it. And now, without any identifiable reason, it was telling her that going north was a mistake. She kept that to herself, for the moment, and watched James and Lauren talk. Samael POV. School had finished a couple of hours ago. I stepped out of the bathroom with a towel around my waist, the last of the steam still drifting behind me. My body doesn't need showers as often as I take them, but old habits die hard, and there's something about flowing water that settles my mind like little else. I dressed simply, a white t-shirt, black jeans, white shoes, then opened the top drawer of the dresser, where a flat box sat. Inside were several of my watches. I glanced over them before selecting the Patek Philippe Calatrava, fastened it to my wrist, and reached for the cologne. Then I headed down to the garage. As I drove, my thoughts circled a problem I hadn't been able to set aside since earlier in the week. My original plans regarding Forks had been built on a specific assumption, that I would keep a comfortable distance from the Cullens, close enough to stay informed, yet far enough to act without complication. That assumption no longer holds. I was as close to them now as possible, which changed everything. Then a sharper thought surfaced, one I kept returning to despite myself: James. Specifically, the fact that James had hunted Alice when she was still human, and that he was, directly or indirectly, the reason she was forced to turn at all. My grip on the wheel tightened slightly. Something dangerous stirred within whenever I let that thought linger. I spent the rest of the drive reworking my plans around the new reality, but the anger didn't leave. But then I turned onto the Cullens Road, and I saw Alice standing on the stone porch. She wore a beautiful dress and was turning slightly from side to side, as she sometimes did when she was pleased with something and couldn't quite contain it. The moment she spotted my car, a wide, entirely unguarded smile spread across her face. The anger didn't disappear, that would be the wrong word. It was simply put away. Whatever needed to be dealt with could wait a little longer. I couldn't allow that part of my thinking to exist in the same space as her. I parked and stepped out. She descended a few of the porch steps as I came up the path, closing the distance between us, and stopped on the last one to wait. I reached her and kissed her, and she brought both hands up to my face with gentleness. I rested my hands at her waist and held her there for a moment before we pulled back. "Are you sure you don't want to eat anything?" she asked. "It would be too strange," I said, "eating while everyone watches." She giggled and nodded. "True," she agreed. She leaned in, placing a quick, playful kiss on my lips before pulling back and slipping her fingers into mine. "Come on," she said, her voice hushed with excitement. "They're waiting." Without giving me a chance to respond, she tugged me gently toward the door and led me inside. Chapter 35, Chapter 35 I Will Answer. Samael POV. Alice led me upstairs, and I took in the house as we went. It was impressive by any reasonable standard, but perspective is a strange thing. Coming from 2025, having seen what I'd seen, it shifted the way I looked at everything. We stepped into a large room, and I recognized it at once, the space where they typically gathered in the movies. The first person I clocked was Emmett. He was on one of the sofas with his arm around Rosalie's shoulder, and when he saw me, he broke into a wide, easy grin. "And here's our feathered friend," he said. I smiled as I walked in. Carlyle came forward first and extended his hand. "It's good to properly meet you this time, Samael." I shook it. "I agree. Easier when we're pretending not to know who we are." He smiled and nodded. Then he turned slightly and gestured beside him. "This is my wife, Esme." She looked at me warmly. "It's lovely to meet you in person. Alice has told us quite a lot about you." "Likewise," I said. "She mentioned her family quite often." Esme and Carlyle both smiled at that. Then a voice came from across the room. I hope only good things. Edith had entered from the far side, Jasper a step behind her. As they came closer, Jasper stepped forward and extended his hand, which I shook. Nothing to worry about, I said, pausing for a beat. Or rather, Alice hid anything questionable very well. Emmett laughed, and even Jasper's mouth shifted briefly toward something that might have been a smile, though it disappeared the moment Edith glanced at him. Edith looked back at me, eyes slightly narrowed. You don't seem particularly uneasy, she said, though without hostility, for someone standing in a room full of vampires. And you're all not watching me the way you were at the beginning. As I said it, I put my arm around Alice's waist. I think we're both trusting Alice's judgment. Edith smiled at that. Well, Esme said, smoothly redirecting things, Alice mentioned you'd already eaten, but can I get you something to drink? Some water would be lovely, thank you. Give me a minute, she said and headed out. Carlyle gestured toward the seating area. Please, make yourselves comfortable. Alice and I sat together. I leaned back into the cushions. Alice settled to my left and took my hand, resting it on my thigh. A minute later, Esme returned with a glass of water and set a plate of cookies on the coffee table nearby. Just in case, she said. I smiled and nodded. The motherly energy radiating off her was unmistakably genuine. Carlyle settled into his seat. So, how are you finding Forks? I knew what to expect coming here, I said, but I still hoped it would be at least a little sunnier. I smiled as I said it. Yeah, Emmett said with a grin, sunshine's not really part of the package here. Apparently not, I said. Though I can't say I mind it too much. After that, we exchanged a few more easy questions. Then Carlyle settled back slightly and said, perhaps you have some questions for us. I considered it briefly, then shook my head. Alice has told me what I need to know for now. I think the rest will come naturally. He nodded. You also seem to know about the existence of our kind before coming here, if I am not mistaken. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly. Everyone was watching me. Alice simply looked curious. I was, I said. You don't seem to carry the same aversion our neighbors do, Esme said carefully. I tend to judge based on actions, I replied. A vampire who doesn't kill humans for blood isn't that different, to me, from your neighbors. The statement was met with some surprise. Edith leaned forward slightly. So you're not what we'd call a natural enemy. What do you mean exactly? Wolves are considered a kind of natural enemy to us. Aren't you the same? I thought for a moment. Alice asked me something similar, but I need to adjust the answer I gave her. I looked at Edith. I'm neither a natural enemy of yours, nor am I like the wolves. Emmett's brow furrowed. But aren't you also shifting into that feathered lion thing? Winged lion, Alice said, without missing a beat. Which caused a quiet warmth flickered in my chest. Emmett looked entirely unbothered by the correction. Yeah, he said. That. Birds, insects, mammals, I said. They're all part of the same kingdom, even though they are very different from one another. Emmett's expression suggested that it hadn't clarified much for him. Carlyle stepped in. So you're saying shapeshifter is more of a broad classification, and you and the wolves fall into very different categories within it. That's how I see it, at least, I said. The wolves, or spirit warriors, as they call themselves, may look similar to me on the surface, but the differences are fundamental. One of the most important things you mentioned, they are, in a very real sense, a natural counterforce to vampires. Not just enemies by circumstance. Their very awakening is tied to your presence. I set the glass down. There are also other differences in how we shift and what we're capable of, but I'm not an expert on all their capabilities. Edith tilted her head slightly. Interesting. So in theory, there could be other subgroups as well. In theory, I said. Though I've never come across any evidence of that myself. As we talked, I became aware of something in my peripheral vision. Rosalie's expression, which had started out neutral enough, was gradually tightening with each exchange. Her brows drew further together the longer it went on, until finally she spoke. Emmett had already noticed. I caught him glancing at her the moment she opened her mouth, a faint unease crossing his face. How? She said. Everyone looked at her. You said you knew about vampires before coming here. You seem to know quite a lot about shapeshifters too. Her tone was measured at first, but an edge sharpened beneath it as she continued. Alice told us your parents died, and they weren't even like why. Rosalie. Alice's voice cut across the room. Rosalie stopped. Samael has been nothing but respectful to everyone here and has answered every question put to him. Alice's tone wasn't loud, but her serious gaze left no room for argument. I expect at least the same amount of respect in return. The room went still. I raised an eyebrow and looked at Alice for a moment, a small smile I couldn't suppress finding its way onto my face. Edith, across the room, had a similar expression. Rosalie opened her mouth, then closed it again, apparently unable to find what she wanted to say. I looked back at Rosalie, letting my expression settle into something calmer and more even. I will answer those questions, I said. Alice turned to look at me. Sammy, you don't have to do that. I know, I said. But the question is fair, and it's clearly shared. I glanced briefly around the room, and the faces looking back at me confirmed it well enough. However, what I tell you next, I'll ask you to keep between us. It matters to me, and I hope it helps build some trust here. She tightened her grip on my hand slightly, then looked around the room. Of course, she said, looking around. All of us. The expressions in the room shifted, more attentive, more serious. Carlyle said, you have our word, Samael. And I want you to know your patience with us is very much appreciated. I nodded and took a moment before starting. My first encounter with vampires and most of what I know are connected to the same event, I said. It was only a few weeks after I first discovered my new nature. I was running in the forest near my home when I spotted a man. Something about him was immediately wrong, red eyes, movements too fast, too precise. He smelled different. But what concerned me most was what he was doing. He was tracking someone. Following traces, my traces, as it turned out. I paused briefly. One of the first things my new nature gave me was instinct. Not instinct in the ordinary sense, something closer to a sixth sense. And what it told me about this man was clear. He was a predator, and he was following me. So I did what felt like the only right thing to do in that moment. I paused again. I eliminated the threat. The room was quiet. After disabling him, I tried to get answers. But his responses were vague, and once he started panicking, it became difficult to work with him. What was totally clear back then was that my lack of knowledge put me in a vulnerable position, and I couldn't afford that. I paused briefly. The same instinct that warned me about him, also revealed the solution to that problem. I lifted my right hand as I spoke, and let the shift come. My hand became large and furred, and a set of long, sharp claws extended from the fingers. Several pairs of eyes widened around the room. With these, I was able to absorb fragments of his memories. Not everything, but enough. I let the shift recede and settled back. A brief silence followed as I let the shift recede. Their surprise was palpable. Edith was the first to break the quiet. You took the memories. Just like that. I gave a small nod. Not everything. But enough to understand what I'm dealing with. Carlyle leaned forward slightly. It's unusual to find a vampire with that much knowledge of shapeshifters. His memories gave me the location of his coven and of what they had been doing. I spoke evenly, without elaborating further, but the implication landed clearly enough. Esme exhaled quietly. So I don't feel particularly guilty about using them to fill in the missing gaps, I added. Jasper, who had said very little until now, spoke from across the room. You're describing taking out an entire coven as if it were so simple. I looked at him and smiled. Sometimes the most dangerous position you can be in is being too certain you're at the top of the food chain. Chapter 36, Chapter 36 An Unexpected Call. Jasper raised an eyebrow at my answer, genuine surprise flashing across his face before his usual composure returned. Several others around the room wore similar expressions, a kind of recalibration happening behind their eyes. Carlyle looked thoughtful now, studying me with even greater interest. For a few seconds, silence settled over the room. Emmett was the first to break it. A slow grin spread across his face, and he said, "Good. We'll have to test what you're made of." The tone was light, playful even, but there was something underneath it. Excitement. Curiosity. The thrill of finally meeting something that might actually challenge him, or at least make life a little more interesting. I smiled back at him. "Just remember," I said calmly, "you're the one who asked for that." Emmett's grin widened immediately, though this time it looked sharper, more anticipatory. Alice nudged me lightly from the left. I turned to look at her, and she met my eyes with an expression that was trying its best to look serious and mostly succeeding at looking adorable. "Today you're mine. I already have to suffer through missing you tomorrow." I squeezed her hand and let my voice carry just far enough to reach another set of ears across the room. "Don't worry, dear. I don't think he's lacking time." My eyes flickered briefly toward Emmett. "Maybe patience. But not time." Alice giggled. Several smiles appeared around the room. Even Rosalie's lips twitched faintly upward before she caught herself. Emmett exhaled in a long, theatrical sigh and leaned back into the couch as though deeply wronged. "Wow," he muttered, shaking his head. "I'm getting attacked in my own home." The atmosphere softened considerably after that. I let the moment settle, then turned my attention back to Rosalie. "So," I said, keeping my tone easy, "was that enough to fill those gaps?" She held my gaze, but her initial certainty had clearly begun to waver. The sharp hostility in her expression softened, leaving her visibly unsure of her footing. The knowledge that I'd killed vampires for that information still troubled her, but the certainty she'd approached the conversation had become harder to maintain. After a moment, she looked away. "It did," she admitted. Emmett immediately pulled her a little closer against his side in silent reassurance. Esme's posture relaxed, and a quiet warmth returned to her face. After that, as if by some unspoken agreement, the conversation naturally drifted to easier topics. We talked about Forks, school, the weather, absurdly small local gossip that Emmett somehow found entertaining, and a dozen other ordinary things. I had almost settled into the rhythm of it when Edith asked a question that caught me off guard. "Sorry, Samael, for being direct," she said, looking at me steadily, "but this is actually important. Did you properly launder the money before buying the car?" I looked at her for a moment. "Sorry." Carlyle stepped in, his tone measured. "I believe Edith assumes that, given your age and the fact that your family wasn't wealthy, the funds you've been working with may have come from the coven you encountered." Edith gave a small nod to confirm it and continued watching me. Alice turned slightly toward me. Her expression was gentle and careful, trying to soften the moment. "She has a point, darling. If that's where the money came from, spending it on something this expensive, without making it clean first, could create legal problems." Before I could answer, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I reached in and pulled out my Motorola, flipping it open. "Alfred." I looked at the screen for a brief moment, then pressed end and closed the phone. I was with Alice, business could wait. A second later, it rang once more. My expression sharpened, and my brows furrowed. Alfred didn't call twice without a reason. It was an agreement we'd made early on, 2 calls meant an immediate decision was needed, or something had gone wrong. I exhaled through my nose, glanced at Alice, and gave her a small smile. Well, I said, this might actually answer your question. She looked at me with a question she didn't voice. Around the room, several others wore similarly curious expressions. I opened the phone and answered. I'm a little busy right now. Something happened, Alfred? I apologize for the interruption, sir. His voice was composed, as it always was. You instructed me to notify you personally once the task was completed. I'm listening. What I didn't notice at first was the reaction around me. Alice, especially, was staring. My demeanor had changed. Normally, even when calm, there was warmth in my expression around her. But now every trace of it was gone. Even at school, when I wasn't around Alice, there was usually a certain ease to my expression. This was different. My face had become unreadable, my voice colder and more precise. It concerns the small startup you tasked me to arrange a meeting with, Alfred continued. YouTube. Yes, I said. Did you succeed? Affirmative, sir. Though I must admit, based on my research, I fail to understand the interest. The platform appears to be little more than an online dating service. I do not foresee significant growth. A smile touched my lips, different this time, colder. And it won't remain one, I replied. Its future purpose is different. That's not something you need to concern yourself with for now. I understand. There was a brief pause, followed by the faint sound of papers shifting. As instructed, I secured the earliest possible meeting. You are scheduled to meet their executive on Tuesday at 11 am in San Mateo. Good. I'll be there. Prepare cash and all documentation required for an equity investment, I added. For what amount? 800,000 should be sufficient to begin with. The sound of a pen on paper came through the phone. I will assign one of our staff to deliver everything to you at the location. A brief pause, and then, my only reservation, for the record, is that I don't quite see why your presence there is necessary. It has to be done this way, I said evenly. And it's not a criticism of your abilities. This situation simply doesn't allow room for failure. I understand. Is there anything else? No, sir. That will be all. Good. Have a good evening, Alfred. You too, Mr. Ashbourne. I closed the phone and lowered it slowly. Edith looked genuinely lost for once. Her original question had been answered, yes. That much was clear. What was equally clear was that she now had considerably more questions. Most of the others present seemed to be in the same position. I held Edith's gaze and let a small smile settle on my face. You don't need to worry about my financial situation, I said, or about the legitimacy of the funds. I've never used anything acquired from those vampires. Every person in the room was watching me. The feeling was oddly similar to when I had revealed my claws earlier, except this time the surprise was mixed with genuine confusion, puzzlement, mostly. Alice was not among them. She looked entirely unbothered by any of it. The bond between us had formed absurdly quickly, leaving little room for doubt or hesitation on either side. Darling, she said, who is Alfred? I looked at her, and the colder edge in my demeanor faded almost instantly. He's the CEO of a company I started about 6 months ago, I said.
Frontline.
Alice blinked. You founded a company. I did. What does it do? Investments, primarily. Though we're also setting up electronics production, that side of things should be running soon. She listened with complete attention, entirely fascinated. And honestly, she was distractingly adorable when she looked at me like that. For a moment, I forgot everyone else was still in the room. A quiet cough broke the moment. I looked up. It was
Lost
Carlyle.
the lead.
wearing a politely amused expression. Alice noticed too. Yet it didn't seem to trouble her in the slightest. She simply moved closer, wrapped both arms around my torso, and leaned against me comfortably as I settled my hand over her waist. Esme smiled warmly at the sight. Carlyle said, "I can only say that I'm genuinely impressed, Samael. Building a company at your age, without any external support, is not a small thing. Though I suspect the timeline isn't entirely unconnected to when you first came into your abilities." "You're right," I said. "Simply put, it considerably enhanced my learning capabilities." He raised an eyebrow, and I could see interest replacing any lingering caution in the room. The last traces of suspicion had mostly disappeared, replaced now by curiosity. Then Alice rose to her feet, her hand already holding mine. "Right," she said, smiling. "They've definitely kept you long enough. Come on. I'll show you around the house." She gave my hand a light but purposeful tug. I stood, laughing quietly. "Lead the way." No one said anything as she pulled me from the room and toward the stairs. I could feel several pairs of eyes on our backs, and I didn't mind them. "Hi everyone. I'm back. Why didn't I post a new chapter for so long?" Long story short, I got sick, fell behind on my university deadlines, and had to pause writing for a while. Sorry for the delay. Chapter 37, Chapter 37 The Painting. Barely containing her excitement, Alice pulled me from the living room into the rest of the house. Her hand was firmly wrapped around mine as she guided me as if she'd been waiting all day for this exact moment. I had a general picture of the house from the films. However, the films were never particularly consistent, different angles, varying layouts, and I was quite certain they'd used more than one location across the sequels. But actually being here made one thing immediately obvious: what had appeared on screen was only a fraction of the real place, significantly larger, easily twice the size of the movie version. Standing at the entrance and looking up, you'd count 4 levels, though that number was slightly misleading. The lowest one didn't primarily function as a living space. Nestled into a cliffside, the house's ground floor was largely swallowed by the landscape, dedicated instead to practical purposes. The west half was taken up by a garage, large enough for 4 cars. Unlike the pristine minimalism of the rest of the house, this area actually looked used. Tools hung neatly from the walls, spare parts were stacked here and there, and several workbenches were covered in mechanical components in various stages of assembly. Rosalie and Emmett's territory, most likely. Between the garage and the ground floor entrance was another lounge area. This informal guest space was as tasteful as everything else in the house, but even by Cullen's standards, it looked too neat, too untouched, clearly not getting much use. From there, we went back upstairs. She showed me the rest of the first floor. One half was a large open area connected directly to the famous kitchen, a space I immediately recognized as the one Alice had used for the graduation party in the 3rd film. The other half was where we'd already spent most of the afternoon, the living room where I'd met the family, with Carlisle's office and Edward's piano room close to it. Throughout the tour, Alice walked slightly ahead of me, narrating everything with a thoroughness and enthusiasm I found quietly charming. By the time we reached the staircase leading upward again, I realized I had been grinning almost constantly since leaving the living room. She then led me up to the 2nd floor. "This is where our private rooms are," she said, glancing back at me. As we moved down the hall, she pointed at each door in turn, naming its occupant. The floor was divided between herself, Emmett and Rosalie, Jasper, and Edith, while Carlisle, Esme, and Edward's rooms were 1 floor above. There was a brief flicker of amusement in her eyes before she pointed toward the final door. "And this one," she said, "is mine." Her voice softened slightly on the last word. The door was already slightly open. She pushed it gently and stepped inside, and I followed. I started looking around. The room was quite large, around 40 square meters, but none of it felt wasted. The room felt carefully designed
Enemy
around
UAV
its
spotted.
occupant. It was divided into distinct areas that each served its own purpose while cohering harmoniously. The first thing that drew my eye was a reading space near the center of the room, a soft couch beside a standing lamp, with several low bookshelves arranged around it, that quietly separated it from the rest of the space. The closest wall was lined from top to bottom with shelving, packed with considerably more books than the shorter ones could hold. In the right corner of the room was a work table covered in fashion sketches, fabric swatches, and half-finished designs arranged in what I could only describe as organized chaos. The entire right wall was essentially a wardrobe, its length broken up by stylish curtains drawn across it at intervals, each one a deliberate choice rather than an afterthought. I moved further into the room. Then something else caught my eye. A large double bed. I slowly raised an eyebrow and looked at Alice. I thought vampires didn't sleep. Alice followed my gaze. We don't, she said easily. But it's comfortable. I like having fluffy things to lie on. I raised an eyebrow. What? She asked, her tone carrying a faint defensiveness, though the amusement dancing in her eyes ruined the effect entirely. I smiled and shook my head silently. My attention then shifted toward the far left corner, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a wide view of the forest below. An easel stood there. I walked toward it slowly, my eyes settling on the canvas resting upon it. What was on the canvas made something warm and quiet settle in my chest. It pictured the scene from our first date. The two of us were lying on a blanket, her head resting on my chest, while ribbons of green and blue light danced above us. It was beautiful. The brief painting lesson Alice had given me, the lesson in which my instant mastery had given me enough insight to see beyond the surface, allowing me to appreciate the care in every brush stroke. Looking at the painting now, I could almost feel how deeply she treasured that memory. For several seconds, I simply stared at it in silence. I could almost feel that night again. Do you like it? Alice's voice pulled me from the painting. I turned. Alice was watching me from a short distance away, with the fingers of one hand pressed lightly to her lips and her elbow resting in the palm of the other. There was subtle anticipation in her posture as she waited for my answer. I closed the distance between us and slipped an arm around her waist, gently pulling her closer. Her hands settled naturally against my chest as she tilted her head to look up at me. Do I like it? I repeated quietly. She waited silently. I glanced back toward the painting before returning my gaze to her. Honey. I love it. Then I added softly, although I should point out a flaw. Her eyes widened slightly. A flaw? I smiled, and a brief silence settled between us. She looked up at me with bright golden eyes, her small face so impossibly perfect that it was almost difficult to hold her gaze without losing my train of thought. I brushed a dark strand of hair behind her ear. Not even you, my dear, could ever capture the true extent of your own beauty. She stared at me for a moment, visibly caught off guard, her lips parting slightly as if the words had bypassed her defenses. Her mouth opened to speak, but no sound came. Then she suddenly rose onto her tiptoes and kissed me. The kiss began softly, her lips pressing unhurriedly against mine. Her hands rose to frame my jaw, fingers weaving into my hair as she drew herself nearer. The moment her hands slid up from my chest to my neck, that initial gentleness ignited, using the arm around her waist to draw her closer, her body molding against mine until every inch of space vanished and her breasts flattened against my chest. My other hand moved slowly along her back, tracing the ridge of her spine. As it reached the curve of her lower back, it paused, then descended to cup one of her cheeks. I squeezed gently, feeling the firm give of flesh beneath my palm. She gasped against my lips, her mouth opening wider, the tip of her tongue brushing against mine. She pressed against me without hesitation, and I felt the distinct, growing pressure straining against my jeans. When she registered what was pressing into her thigh, confusion flickered in her expression, quickly replaced by understanding. Rather than pulling back, she leaned further into me, her lips parting fully, her tongue sliding against mine as her hands tangled in my hair. She tasted faintly sweet and cool. Her movements against me made it impossible to think of anything else. My hand on her buttock kneaded deeper, pulling her hips tighter against mine, and she let out a low, desperate sound that vibrated from her lips into mine. Several minutes passed, possibly more. As we finally pulled apart, her lips lingered, tracing mine before the distance settled between us. Our foreheads rested together, her eyes half-lidded, a dazed, satisfied smile playing on her lips. I gasped, breathing like a runner who'd just crossed the finish line, not from physical exertion, but from the sheer effort of holding back. My eyes, I knew, had taken on a golden hue. We exchanged a long, silent look, letting the intensity of the moment slowly subside. Neither of us was particularly concerned about the 6 vampires 1 floor below. What truly held us back was simpler, an unspoken understanding that if we let things go any further, there would be no turning back, no stopping what had begun. Despite how desperately I wanted her, this was not how I wanted our first time together to happen. Alice understood this without words. Eventually, she smiled softly, stole one final lingering kiss from me, and rested against my chest as we slowly calmed ourselves. We remained where we were, close and warm and slightly disheveled, until the wanting became something quieter. The light outside was fading. We lay together on her bed. I rested on my back, eyes closed, as Alice lay beside me, propped lightly on one elbow. Her fingers traced delicate, feather-light patterns across my face and neck, barely grazing my skin. Rain drifted softly through the distant forest. Alice continued her absent-minded caress, her eyes fixed on my face. Without realizing it, a profound sense settled over me. I felt at peace. It was the most peaceful I had felt in longer than I could remember myself in this world. Not the absence of something difficult, but the genuine presence of something genuinely good. Like finally being still after a long, restless journey. I didn't notice when it happened, but at some point, I simply drifted off to sleep. General, POV. Alice didn't immediately notice he had fallen asleep. His breathing had slowed slightly, becoming deeper and steadier, but the change was so subtle, easily missed by someone unfamiliar with it. Especially by her, who had spent over a century surrounded by creatures that never slept. Perhaps she would learn to discern it later. She continued tracing her fingers slowly across his face, looking at him with gentle fascination. Then, less than 10 minutes after his eyes had closed, she heard it. Alice froze. At first, she thought she had imagined it, but then it came again, a soft, rumbling vibration. Her eyes widened in surprise as realization dawned. It was, unmistakably, a purr. Low and rhythmic, it bore no resemblance to a domestic cat's sound. This was deeper, carrying a weight that made the air itself feel different. It reminded her more of a large predator resting contentedly in the sun than anything tame or harmless. And somehow, that made it infinitely more adorable. Her expression softened to one of pure affection. "Oh my God," she whispered softly. Her heart would have been racing if it still could. Carefully, as though afraid of disturbing him, she shifted closer. Her face hovered just beside his. She leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss against his cheek. The rumbling purr deepened slightly in response, nearly destroying what little composure she had left. A quiet, helpless smile spread across her lips as her fingers slid softly into his hair. "I love you so much, my kitten," she whispered. "You have no idea how hard it's becoming to hold myself back." Samael might have dearly wanted to hear those words. But he was far too occupied drifting through the imaginary sky his sleeping mind had conjured, wrapped in warmth, peace, and the quiet presence of the girl whose gaze held him as the most precious thing in her world. New chapter is coming soon. Write a review.